Tonight, we're diving into a gentle what-if from the world of Dune, the long, quiet story of a night that once ended in ruin, and how everything might have unfolded had it ended otherwise. Imagine the betrayal on Arrakis, the shields falling, the enemy pouring into the halls of Arrakis. And imagine that this time, by a warning that came a moment sooner and a loyal hand that acted in time, Duke Leto Atreides was not lost. Imagine the father Paul was fated to lose living on, standing beside his son through all the years that followed. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will follow a house that endured instead of falling, a father who lived to guide his son, and a kinder path through the desert, one without the great and terrible war. You do not need to remember any of it, and you do not need to hold on. Let the story move through you like a slow tide across the dunes, and let it carry you, softly, down toward sleep. There is a certain hour on Arrakis when the night is at its deepest, when the two moons have wheeled low toward the horizon, and the great city of Arrakis lies hushed beneath its stone and its silence. On this night, in the telling we already know, that hour was chosen for treachery. The Harkonnens had woven their patient web across many years, and hidden within their ranks, wearing borrowed colors, marched the Emperor's own Sardaukar, the soldier fanatics of Seleucus Secundus, whose presence on this world was itself the darkest of secrets. Everything had been arranged. The house shields were to fail from within. The gates were to open to an enemy who had promised to spare no one who wore the hawk of House Atreides. And so it began, as it was always meant to begin. A drug had been given, quietly, to a man who guarded the Duke's own person, and that man slept when he should have watched. The generators that fed the house shields were tampered with, their fields flickering and then falling one by one, like candles pinched out by an unseen hand along a corridor. Beyond the walls, in the darkness of the outer city, shapes gathered. The betrayal had a shape and a schedule, and by every reckoning of the enemy it should have unfolded to its bitter and complete conclusion. The Duke taken, the son hunted, the mother cast into the deep desert to die among the sands. But here the telling turns. Here the trap that should have closed does not close. For on this night a warning came a single moment sooner than it was meant to come. It is a small thing, the difference of a moment, the space of one breath drawn and released. Yet the whole weight of a house and the whole shape of a future can balance upon so slight a hinge. A loyal servant, moving through the lower halls on an errand he could not later fully explain, noticed a door that stood open where no door should have stood open, and a coldness in the air where the shield fields ought to have hummed. He did not shout. He did not run in panic. He simply understood, in the quiet and complete way that understanding sometimes comes, that the house was already dying around him, and that there were only seconds left in which anything might yet be saved. And in those seconds, he acted. He went not outward toward the gathering enemy, but inward, toward the heart of the house, toward the chambers where the Duke lay. Down the long passages he moved, past the still fountains and the tapestries that hung motionless in the windless dark, and he carried with him nothing but the knowledge that a betrayal was unfolding, and that a man he had sworn to serve was about to be delivered into the hands of those who hated him beyond all reason. Consider how narrow the margin truly was. In the other telling, the one where the trap closes as designed, the Duke was already lost by this hour, drugged and bound and carried off to be set before the Baron in mockery. The poison meant for him had already done its patient work. The great household had already begun to scatter into the streets, into capture, into death. In that telling, the loyal men fell one after another, and the boy and his mother fled with only the sand ahead of them and the whole Imperium arrayed at their backs. All of that hung, on this night, upon whether a single warning arrived in time or arrived too late. It arrived in time, only just, only barely, by the breadth of one heartbeat, but it arrived. The Duke was roused before the poison could be brought to him, before the false stillness could be pressed upon his senses. Hands that were loyal reached him before hands that were treacherous, and though the enemy still poured through the failing gates, though the Sardaukar still moved through the outer courts in their borrowed armor, the very center of the trap, the taking of Duke Leto Atreides himself, faltered. The plan had been built with such confidence that its makers had left no allowance for failure at its heart. When that heart did not fall as commanded, a tremor ran through the whole design, invisible in the moment, yet vast in its meaning. All around Arrakis, the terrible night went on. There was smoke and there was ruin, and there were men who did not live to see the dawn, and none of that was undone by the single mercy of one moment. This is not a telling in which nothing was lost. Much was lost. Good and faithful people who loved their house gave everything they had to give, and the halls that had rung with music only days before now stood scarred and silent. The gentleness of this story does not pretend otherwise. It only asks us to notice the one thread that, in another life, would have snapped, and that here, against all the careful cruelty arrayed against it, held, for the enemy had counted on certainty. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen had counted on it, sitting far away in the safety of his own designs, savoring in advance the completeness of his revenge. The Emperor's men had counted on it, the disciplined Sardaukar, who did not know the meaning of a plan gone wrong. Everyone who had set this night in motion had assumed that the falling shields and the drugged guard and the opened gate would carry the whole thing through to its appointed end without flaw. They had forgotten, as those who trust only in cruelty so often forget, that loyalty is also a force in the world, quieter than armies and slower than poison, but real and sometimes swift enough. So the hush of that hour, which had been meant to be the hush of a house being smothered, became instead something stranger and more fragile. It became the breathless pause in which a house that should have died discovered that it was, somehow, still breathing. The Duke lived. Wounded the night still was, and grievous the harm it did. But at its very center, the thing the enemy most wanted did not come to pass. The great trap of Arrakis, laid across years and sprung with such patience, missed by the width of a single moment the one prize it had been built to seize. There would be a reckoning for all of this, in time. There would be questions of how the warning came, and who had opened the way for the enemy, and what was to be done with a house that had been struck so hard and yet not felled. But those were matters for the hours and days that would follow. On this night there was only the astonishment of survival, thin and quiet and almost too much to believe, spreading through the scattered and frightened members of the household like the first faint gray of a dawn that no one had dared expect to see. And somewhere in the shadowed heart of that broken and unbroken house, a father still drew breath, and a son still had a father, and the whole current of what was to come bent, in that instant, toward a gentler channel. The sand outside the walls did not yet know it. The moons setting over the desert did not yet know it. But the trap that should have closed had failed to close, and everything, quietly, was different now. Up next in Chapter 2, The Duke Who Lived, we will follow Leto Atreides through the strange first hours of a survival that was never meant to be his, and feel the wonder of a man carried to safety who, in another life, would already have been mourned. There is a particular strangeness that settles over a man who has passed through the very door of death and found, upon the other side, that he is still living. Duke Leto Atreides came to know that strangeness in the deep hours after the fall of Arrakis, and it lay upon him more heavily than any wound, for he had prepared himself, in the quiet of his own mind, to die. A leader who understands the game of houses understands also its price, and Leto had long since made a private peace with the thought that the desert world might be his ending. To wake instead into the dim shelter where loyal hands had hidden him, to feel his own heart still beating beneath the bruises and the fever, was to feel the floor of the world tilt gently beneath him into some unfamiliar shape. He was wounded, and he was shaken, and for a time he was not wholly himself. The treachery had touched him before it was interrupted, and his body carried the marks of that touch. He was carried through the dark by those who had refused to let him fall, out of the ruined heart of the city and into hiding, moving low and quiet through the sheltering night, while the household scattered around him in every direction like sparks blown from a dying fire. There was fever in him, and there were long stretches where the world came to him only in fragments, in the sway of being carried, in the murmur of low voices, in the cool of a damp cloth laid across his brow by someone who would not give their weariness a name. And yet he lived. That single fact hung over everything. Impossible and undeniable at once. The man who in another life would have died for his son, who would have spent his final breath in a doomed and defiant gesture against the baron who tormented him, now breathed on in the darkness, his chest rising and falling, his pulse a quiet insistence beneath the skin. It was a wonder so large that those near him could scarcely hold it in their thoughts. They had braced themselves for grief. They had felt already, in the first hours of the assault, the cold certainty that their duke was gone. To find that certainty overturned was to be given back something they had already, in their hearts, surrendered. The desert kept its own counsel around the place where he was hidden. Out beyond the walls of the makeshift shelter, the sand stretched away under the setting moons, indifferent and vast, and the wind moved across it with the same patience it had shown for 10,000 years. Arrakis did not celebrate the survival of a duke. It never celebrated anything. But there was a mercy in its very indifference, for the same emptiness that could kill a man could also hide him, and the same silence that swallowed the cries of the fallen could also cover the breathing of one who had not fallen after all. In the vastness of that world, a single sheltered life was easy to lose, and for once the losing was a gift. Around him the great household of House Atreides had come apart, flung wide by the violence of the night. Some of his people were taken, and some were dead, and some were scattered into the streets and the wastes, with no knowledge of whether their duke lived or lay among the slain. This was the strangeness of it, that his survival and their scattering were true at the very same moment. The house that would have fallen entirely, that would have been erased from Arrakis and mourned across the Imperium, still stood. But it stood battered almost past recognition, its halls broken, its numbers thinned, its certainties shattered like glass beneath a heel. To say that House Atreides endured is not to say that it endured whole. It endured the way a great tree endures a storm that strips away half its limbs, alive at the root, alive in the trunk, but marked forever by the night that nearly took it down. Leto himself, in the clearer moments that came as the fever eased, began to reckon with what his own survival meant. He was a man who had always thought in terms of duty, and he understood that his continued life was not merely a private mercy, but a fact that changed the shape of everything around him. A dead duke is a wound that closes over, a name to be mourned and then, in the cold arithmetic of the great houses, replaced. A living duke is a question that will not be put to rest. As long as he breathed, The thing his enemies had wanted was not finished. As long as he breathed, there remained a center around which the scattered pieces of his house might one day gather again. He felt the weight of that, even in his weakness, the way a man half sunk in fever can still feel the pull of an unfinished task. And there was his son. Through all the fever and the strangeness, the thought of Paul ran like a steady thread that Leto would not release. In the other life, the life that had almost been, this was the very hour in which the boy was left fatherless, thrust alone and far too young into a destiny that would have crushed a lesser soul and nearly crushed him even so. In that life, the last gift Leto could give his son was the manner of his dying. Here, against all expectation, he had a different gift to give, one so simple and so vast that its very ordinariness made it a marvel. He had the gift of remaining. He had the gift of being there, of being a father who could still be spoken to and leaned upon and learned from in the long years that a boy needs a father most. It was the plainest thing in the world, and it was a miracle, and Leto held to it as he held to his own returning strength. The first light, when it came gray and slow across the sand, and it found the Duke alive to see it. He had watched countless dawns in his life and thought little of them, but this one he received as a man receives a thing he never expected to be given again. The sky paled at its edge. The chill of the desert night began, degree by degree, to lift. Somewhere beyond the horizon, his enemies still believed their work complete, still counted House Atreides among the fallen houses of the Imperium, still savored a victory that was not, after all, entire. They did not yet know. It would be some time before they knew. And in that gap between their certainty and the truth, a wounded man gathered his strength and turned his mind, quietly and without haste, toward all that would need to be done. For survival, he understood, was only the beginning. To live through the night was one thing. To make of that survival something lasting, to draw the scattered household back together, to answer the treachery at its root, to build upon the desert world a future that the enemy had tried so hard to deny him, that was the work of years, and it would ask everything he had. But it was work he could only do because he was alive to do it, and so even the daunting scale of it felt, in that gray and gentle dawn, less like a burden than like a promise. He had been given more time. He did not yet know all that he would do with it. He knew only that he would not waste it. Up next in Chapter 3, A Traitor Undone, we will turn to the hidden hand that opened the door to the enemy and see how the betrayal at the heart of the house was gently, and just in time, drawn out into the light. Every great betrayal has, at its center, a single wound that made it possible. And the wound at the center of this one was love. The traitor within House Atreides was not a man who hated the Duke. That is the sorrow of it, the thing that must be told gently, for a story of pure malice is easier to bear than a story of a good man broken. The one who opened the door to the enemy was Dr. Wellington Yue, the Suk physician, bound to the household by long service and by the deep conditioning of his order, a conditioning that the great houses of the Imperium had always believed could never fail. He was trusted absolutely, and that trust was not foolish, for by every reckoning of his training, he was untrustworthy of nothing. And yet he had been turned, not by greed and not by ambition, but by the oldest lever in the world. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen had taken from Yue his wife, the Bene Gesserit woman named Wana, and held her, and used the doctor's love for her as a slow and patient poison poured into his soul. Yue believed that by doing the terrible thing that was asked of him, he might yet win her freedom, or at the least, her release from suffering. He was wrong in this, as such men are always wrong, for those who traffic in captives do not keep faith. But the belief was enough. It was enough to make a healer, a man sworn against the taking of life, into the hidden hand that would lower the house shields and deliver his duke to ruin. He did not do it lightly. He carried the doing of it like a stone in his chest, and he had planned. In his grief, a bitter turn of his own within the larger treachery, a secret meant to strike back at the Baron even as he served him. In the telling we already know, that plan ran its full and mournful course. Yue disabled the shields, and the enemy came, and the Duke was taken. And the doctor, in his final act, placed within the mouth of the captured Leto a false tooth filled with a killing gas, hoping the Duke might use it to slay the Baron in the moment they were brought face to face. It was a plan built entirely upon dying, upon the certainty that Leto would fall, and it asked of the Duke his own death as the price of a doomed and desperate blow against the man who had destroyed them both. In that telling, the poison was drawn, and lives were spent, and the whole grief of it went forward to its appointed end. But here the telling turns once more. Here the betrayal was foreseen just in time. For there were those in House Atreides who watched, quietly and without ceasing, for exactly such a shadow. The Duke's own men of caution had long felt the faint wrongness that gathers around a plot before it breaks, the small changes in a familiar face, the almost invisible strain in a voice that had never before been strained. Dr. Yue was a good man doing a terrible thing, and a good man doing a terrible thing cannot fully hide the war within himself. It shows in the smallest ways, in a hesitation at a threshold, in eyes that will not quite meet another's, in a tenderness that has become, all at once, unbearably heavy. These signs were seen. They were not, at first, understood, but in the narrow hours before the trap was fully sprung, the pieces drew together in a watchful mind, and understanding came, and it came a moment sooner than the enemy had allowed for. So the poison was drawn out, in every sense. The plot that Yue had woven was unraveled thread by thread before it could be finished. The tampering with the shields was discovered even as it was being done, and though it could not all be undone in time, enough was learned in those crucial moments to send the single warning that turned the whole night aside. The doctor's hidden design, the false tooth, and the desperate hope of a dying blow never had to be used, because the Duke was never delivered helpless into the Baron's hands to use it. The terrible cost that Yue's plan had counted upon, the death of Leto as the price of vengeance, was, by the narrowest of margins, not paid. And what of the traitor himself? Here the story asks for its gentlest handling, for there is no satisfaction to be found in the undoing of a broken man. Dr. Yue was quietly stopped before he could finish his work, taken aside from the unfolding ruin, his part in it laid bare. He did not resist. There was in him, some who were there would later reflect, an almost weary relief, as though a portion of him had longed all along to be prevented, to be spared the completion of the thing his grief had driven him to begin. He had loved his wife beyond the bounds of his conditioning, and that love had been made into a weapon and turned against everything else he held dear. And now the weapon lay stilled in his hands, and he was, at the last, simply a sorrowing man who had been used. The Duke, when he came at length to understand the whole of it, did not meet the knowledge with the fury that a lesser lord might have shown. Leto Atreides understood leverage, and he understood love, and he understood the particular cruelty of a baron who would forge one into a chain to bind the other. He saw in Yue not a monster, but a victim who had been made into an instrument, a man whose every conditioned certainty had been overturned by the oldest force in the human heart. There is a hard justice that punishes only the hand and never asks who guided it. And there is a wiser justice that looks past the hand to the will behind it. Leto, alive and clear-eyed in the aftermath, inclined toward the wiser kind. The true author of the betrayal sat far away in Harkonnen's safety, and it was there, Leto knew, that the reckoning truly belonged. So the betrayal at the heart of the house was, in this telling, drawn out into the light before it could complete its dark work, and the drawing out of it changed everything that followed. Had Yue not been stopped, the Duke would have been taken and killed, and the desperate poison would have been spent, and the whole cascade of grief would have poured forward unchecked. Because he was stopped, gently and in time, the poison stayed undrawn, the killing blow stayed unstruck, and a father stayed alive to raise his son. It is a strange thing to reflect that so much turned upon the unmasking of one sorrowful man, but so it was. The great houses build their power upon armies and fleets and the wealth of worlds, and yet the fate of a house can rest, in the end, upon whether a single hidden wound is seen in time to be bound. The night had held two secrets, then laid one within the other like the halves of a shell. The first was the enemy at the gates, loud and violent and plain. The second was the friend who had been turned into a foe, quiet and hidden and infinitely sadder. Both were answered before the dawn, and with both answered, House Atreides, battered and scattered though it was, found that it had survived not only the sword raised against it from without, but the subtler blade slipped in from within. Up next in Chapter 4, House Atreides endures on Arrakis, we will watch the scattered strength of the house begin to gather again upon the desert world, and see a duke who now knows, with terrible clarity, exactly who wished him dead and why. In the days that followed the night that did not end as it was meant to end, the desert world of Arrakis held its breath, and House Atreides began, slowly and carefully, the patient work of becoming itself again. It is one thing to survive a blow. It is another to gather up what the blow has scattered, to draw the flung pieces back together, to make of a broken thing something whole once more. That work is quieter than any battle, and in its own way harder, for it asks not the courage of a single desperate hour, but the steadier courage of many ordinary days. This was the work that now lay before the wounded Duke and the remnant of his people, and they took it up as men and women take up a burden they know will be long. They had been scattered wide by the violence of the fall. Some had fled into the outer city and hidden themselves among its warrens. Some had gone out into the wastes, into the marginal places where the enemy did not care to follow, and waited there in the heat and the silence for word of whether their house still lived. Some had been taken, and their fates were uncertain, and grieved over even where they could not be known. But among them all ran, in time, a single quiet current of news, passed hand to hand and voice to voice with the greatest care. The news that seemed too large to be true, and yet was true. The Duke lived. Leto Atreides had not fallen, and where before there had been only the numbness of a house believing itself destroyed, there began, faint and then stronger, the pull of a center that had not, after all, been lost. One by one, then, the scattered strength of the house began to find its way back. Loyal soldiers, who had thought themselves the last survivors of a dead cause, learned that the cause still breathed, and turned their steps toward the places where the household was quietly reassembling. Men who had been ready to sell their lives dear in some final and pointless stand found instead that there was a house yet to serve, and a duke yet to guard, and that their loyalty had a living object once more. There is a particular strength that returns to people when they discover that their devotion was not spent in vain, and that strength came back now to the men of House Atreides, slowly, like warmth returning to cold hands held near a fire. The desert itself became, in this gathering, both the danger and the refuge that it had always secretly been. It was danger still, for Arrakis was a world that killed the careless, a place of thirst and heat and the great worms that moved beneath the sand, and none who lived upon it ever forgot the nearness of death. Yet the very harshness that made it deadly made it also a shelter. The enemy held the city and the seats of power, but the enemy could not hold the whole of a world so vast and so empty. In the deep desert there were places no Harkonnen patrol would trouble to search, expanses of sand and rock where a hunted household might gather and regroup unseen. The wasteland that had been meant to be the grave of House Atreides became instead the ground upon which it quietly stood again. What the enemy had counted as the Duke's prison became, in the turning of things, the Duke's sanctuary. And through it all, Leto himself grew stronger, in body and in purpose alike. The fever left him. The wounds began their slow closing, and as his strength returned, so too did the clear and steady working of his mind, which had always been his greatest weapon. He did not rage. Rage was a luxury he could not afford and had never much indulged. Instead, he thought patiently and deeply about all that had happened and all that it meant, and he arrived at a knowledge that would shape everything he did from that hour forward. He knew now, with a terrible and useful clarity, exactly who had wished him dead and exactly why. He had suspected much before, of course. A man does not rise to lead a great house without learning to read the currents of enmity that run beneath the smooth surface of imperial courtesy. But suspicion is one thing, and certainty is another, and the night of the trap had burned away every doubt. He understood now that the Harkonnens had not acted alone. He understood that the Emperor's own Sardaukar had marched against him in borrowed colors, that the Padishah Emperor himself had lent his hidden hand to the destruction of House Atreides. He understood that his house had been struck down not for any failure of its own, but for its very strength, that a duke too admired and too capable had come to seem. To a jealous throne, a danger that must be removed. This was the shape of the thing that had tried to kill him, and now he saw it whole. There was a strange gift hidden inside that dark knowledge. In the other life, the life that had almost been, Leto never lived to see the full picture. He died still, partly in the dark, his understanding incomplete, his vengeance left to a son who would have to piece it all together alone in the years of his exile. Here the Duke lived to know his enemies by name and by motive, and knowledge of that kind is itself a form of power. A man who knows exactly who wishes him dead, and exactly why, is no longer stumbling blindly through a fog of plots. He can see the board. He can reckon the players. He can plan, not in desperation, but with the cold and careful patience of one who intends to be present for the long game and to win it slowly. And so, even in the aftermath of ruin, a quiet resolve took shape within him. He would not answer this with a reckless stroke that would only give his enemies the excuse they wanted. He had learned, at the cost of very nearly everything, how a house could be destroyed in a single night, and he did not intend to hand the Baron or the Emperor a second such night. Instead, he would rebuild. He would gather his strength upon this desert world that had so nearly buried him, and he would make of Arrakis not the tomb his enemies had planned, but the foundation of something they had never foreseen. A House Atreides that had passed through the fire of betrayal and come out, against all expectation, still standing and clear about who it faced. The nights on Arrakis grew a little less fearful as the household drew together. Where before there had been only the scattered and the lost, there was now the beginning of a gathered strength, small still and cautious and far from safe, but real. Fires were kindled in hidden places. Watches were kept. Plans were laid in low voices under the wheeling stars. And at the center of it all, a duke who should have died sat alive among his people, mending thinking, and quietly turning the whole of his considerable will toward the future. He had survived the trap. He had drawn the traitor into the light. Now he set himself to the longer labor of endurance, the labor of a house that meant not merely to have survived one night, but to go on living, and one day to thrive upon the sand that had so nearly claimed it. Up next, in Chapter 5, A Father's Steady Hand, we will turn from the house to the family within it, and see how a living Duke began to shape his son, guiding Paul with a patience and a wisdom the boy was so very nearly denied. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once the worst has passed and not come true. It is not the silence of a place emptied by grief, but the softer hush of a place that has been spared. In the weeks after that terrible night in Arrakis, this was the quiet that filled the halls where House Atreides gathered its breath again. Duke Leto lived. He moved slowly still, favoring the side where the poison had nearly found its way. But he moved, and he spoke, and each morning his son could look across a table and see him there. That simple fact changed everything that would follow. The way a single stone set differently in a river changes the whole course of the water downstream. For Paul Atreides, the change was deeper than he could name in those first days. In another life, one he would never live and never know, the boy would have been thrown alone into the desert with his mother, orphaned by treachery, forced to grow a hard shell of destiny over a wound that never healed. That boy would have carried his father's death like a stone sewn into his chest. But this Paul woke each day to the sound of his father's careful step in the corridor, and the stone was never sewn in. He grew instead with the quiet gift he had so nearly been denied, the gift of a living hand upon his shoulder, guiding, steadying, teaching him without haste. Leto understood, perhaps better than anyone, how narrowly they had all escaped. A wiser man for having stood so close to the edge, he chose to spend the years he had been given not in vengeance, but in the slow and patient work of raising his heir. He knew the ways a great house could shape a young man, and he knew, too, the ways it could break him. He had seen ambition curdle into cruelty in other bloodlines, seen sons made brittle by fathers who demanded rather than showed. So Leto chose to show. He led Paul through the workings of the household as one might lead a traveler through a familiar country, pointing out the landmarks, naming the dangers, never rushing the road. In the mornings, when the heat had not yet risen to its full weight, the Duke would walk with his son through the lower levels of the residency, where the water stores were kept under lock and careful watch. He taught Paul that on Arrakis water was not merely a comfort, but a currency, a promise, a thing that could buy loyalty or spill blood. He taught him to see the value in a single drop the way the desert people saw it, not with greed, but with reverence. And Paul, who had been trained by the Bene Gesserit teachings of his mother and by the deadly arts of the men of his father's house, found that his father's lessons settled into him differently. They came without fear. They came as a father's knowledge passed to a son who had all the time in the world to receive it. There was a patience in Leto now that had not always been his. Before the night that nearly took him, the Duke had carried the swift certainties of a man at war, a man who must decide quickly and cannot afford to linger. But having been brought so close to the end, he had learned the value of the long view. He no longer measured his days in battles won or lost, but in the slow accumulation of small things done well. He taught his son to do the same. When Paul grew impatient, when the young fire in him wished to leap ahead to conclusions, Leto would draw him back gently, showing him that the surest path was often the slowest, and that a house was not built in a single season, but across the quiet labor of many. The men of the household saw the change in their Duke and took heart from it. Thufir Hawat, the aged Mentat, whose mind held the tally of 1,000 threats, watched the father and son with something close to wonder. He had spent his long life calculating the odds of survival for the house he served, and by every calculation, the Atreides should have fallen. That they had not, that the Duke lived and taught and laughed low in the evenings, was a thing his logic could account for, but his heart could scarcely believe. He gave himself to the work of guarding that fragile miracle with all the fierce devotion of a man who had been granted a second chance to keep his oath. Paul, for his part, grew in ways that surprised even those who knew him best. The visions had begun to come to him even then. The strange folding glimpses of what might be. The futures that opened before his inner sight like corridors branching into darkness. In another life, these visions would have terrified a lonely boy, would have pressed upon him the weight of a destiny he did not choose and could not escape. But here, with his father near, Paul found that he could carry them. When the dreams came and left him shaken in the gray hours before dawn, he could rise and find Leto, and the mere presence of the man steadied him. The terrible futures felt less like sentences passed upon him and more like weather he might yet learn to read. Leto did not fully understand the depth of what stirred in his son. He knew the boy was gifted, knew the Bene Gesserit had their designs and their long breeding towards some end they kept close. But he did not press. He gave Paul room to be a young man first and a mystery second, and in that room the boy grew straight and strong. This was perhaps the greatest gift the Duke gave him, greater than any lesson of water or statecraft or the blade. He gave his son the freedom to grow slowly, unhurried by prophecy, unmarked by loss. The desert itself seemed to soften around them, though of course the desert softened for no one. It was the same vast and pitiless expanse of sand and stone and wind that it had always been, home to the great worms that moved beneath its skin and to the hardy people who had made their peace with its cruelty. But the Atreides looked upon it now, not as a trap that had nearly swallowed them, but as a country they might yet come to know and honor. Leto spoke to his son of the desert people, the Fremen, with a respect that few of the great houses had ever troubled to feel. He sensed in them a strength that mattered, and he taught Paul to sense it too. And so the days accumulated, quiet and warm and unremarkable, in the way that only truly precious days can be. A father and a son, walking the halls of a house that should have fallen. A duke who had learned patience from the nearness of his own end. A young man growing into his gifts with a steadying hand always within reach. It was not a grand thing, not the stuff of the great songs that would never now be sung about a martyred duke and his avenging heir. It was something smaller and better. It was an ordinary miracle, the miracle of a family kept whole, and it laid the foundation for all the gentler years to come. Up next in Chapter 6, Paul and Leto, side by side, will follow the father and son as they learn the ways of Arrakis together, studying the spice and the sand and the delicate weave of desert politics, two of them rebuilding a house with patient and loving care. To learn a world is a slow thing, and Arrakis was slower to learn than most, for it gave up its secrets grudgingly and only to those who came to it with patience. In the seasons that followed the night House Atreides was nearly undone, Duke Leto set himself to the task of learning that world alongside his son, and it was in this shared learning that the bond between them deepened into something rare. They studied together, father and son, not as master and pupil bound by rank, but as two travelers upon the same strange road, each finding in the other a companion for the journey. The spice was the heart of it, as the spice was the heart of everything on Arrakis. The melange, that shimmering cinnamon-scented substance drawn from the deep sands, was the reason the great houses coveted this desolate planet, the reason empires held their breath over its dunes. Without it, the guild navigators could not fold space and guide their ships across the vast dark between the stars. Without it, the old and powerful could not stretch their years or sharpen their sight. Leto understood that to hold Arrakis was to hold the thread that bound the whole Imperium together, and he set out to teach his son not merely how the spice was gathered, but what it meant, what weight it carried, what dangers it drew. They would go together sometimes to the edges of the spice fields, guarded and careful, to watch the great harvesters at their work. Paul learned to read the signs of the desert as the veteran spice men read them, the small changes in the color and texture of the sand that spoke of melange beneath, the trembling of the ground that warned of a worm rising. He learned the terrible law of the harvest, that when the sandworm came the machines, and their men must flee, that no measure of spice was worth the life of a crew, and that a house which spent its people carelessly would soon find itself with no people left to spend. Leto taught him this not as policy, but as principle, the deep conviction that the worth of a house was measured in the loyalty it kept, and that loyalty was kept by valuing the least of its servants as much as the greatest. The desert was their second teacher, and a harsher one than the spice. Leto had come to feel that a duke who would rule Arrakis must first understand it, must feel in his own bones the weight of its heat and the danger of its dryness. So he learned, and Paul learned with him, the disciplines of survival in the deep desert. They studied the stillsuits that the Fremen wore, those marvels of close-fitting cloth that reclaimed the body's own moisture and returned it to the wearer, turning a man into a small sealed world that carried its own water. Paul, who had a gift for such things, mastered the fitting of a stillsuit quickly, and he came to feel a quiet kinship with the desert people, who had devised so ingenious a way to live where life should not be possible. Together, they pored over the maps of Arrakis, the charts of the polar regions, and the great shield wall of rock that sheltered Arrakeen, the trackless expanses where no house had ever truly held sway. Leto spoke to his son of the empty places on those maps, the regions marked only as desert and left blank, and he told him that the blank places were not truly empty. He had come to suspect what few of the great lords ever troubled to believe, that the Fremen who dwelt in the deep desert were far more numerous and far more formidable than the imperial census had ever guessed. Where other rulers saw only sand, Leto saw a people, and where they saw a wasteland, he saw a possible strength that might one day mean the difference between his house standing and his house falling. But it was not only the great matters of spice and survival that they studied. There was also the delicate and treacherous weave of politics, the endless careful dance of the great houses beneath the eye of the Padishah emperor. Leto had been born to that dance, and had learned its steps in a hard school, and now he passed what he knew to his son. He taught Paul that in the Imperium a smile might hide a blade, and a gift might carry poison, that the landsrod of the great houses was a nest of ambition where alliances shifted like the dunes themselves. He taught him of the Spacing Guild and its monopoly on travel, of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood and their long and secret designs, of the emperor upon his golden lion throne, who watched every house that grew too strong with a jealous and calculating eye. Paul absorbed these lessons with the quick and hungry mind that had always been his. His mentat training under Thufir Hawat had sharpened his reason to a fine edge, and his mother's Bene Gesserit teachings had given him a subtlety of perception few could match. But it was his father's guidance that bound these gifts together into wisdom. Where the mentat taught him to calculate, and the sisterhood taught him to observe, Leto taught him to care, to hold in his mind not only the cold arithmetic of power, but the warm and human weight of the people that power was meant to serve. This was the lesson that would shape him most. The lesson that a house existed not to glorify its lord, but to shelter its people, and that a ruler who forgot this had already begun to fall. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done, and the swift Arrakis night had drawn its cold blanket over the sands, father and son would sit together and speak of what they had learned. Leto would ask Paul what he had seen, and listen with real attention to the answers, and in the listening Paul grew. For there is no teacher so powerful as one who truly wishes to hear the pupil, and no lesson so deep as the confidence a father gives a son when he trusts him to think. The bond between them grew not in grand declarations, but in these quiet hours, in the small and steady accumulation of shared understanding. And all the while the house rebuilt itself around them. The soldiers who had scattered on that terrible night had gathered again, and the residency that had nearly become a tomb rang once more with the ordinary sounds of a household at its work. There was a carefulness to it all, a sense of a thing rebuilt with love rather than merely restored. For those who have nearly lost something, hold it afterward with tenderer hands. The Atreides had nearly lost everything, and now they held what remained as a precious thing, and in that holding the house grew stronger than it had ever been. So passed the seasons of their learning, father and son side by side, studying the spice and the sand and the endless subtle politics of the Imperium. It was slow work and patient work, the work of years, and there was no glory in it that any bard would sing. But it was the work that mattered, the quiet labor of two people building together what neither could have built alone. And in the shelter of that shared endeavor, Paul Atreides grew toward the man he would become, grounded and steady, an heir prepared not by tragedy but by love. Up next, in Chapter 7, the Harkonnen threat held at bay, we'll follow the slow and careful war of wits between the Atreides and their oldest enemies, the schemes of the Baron blunted and turned aside by a duke who chose patience over desperation. Enmity between great houses does not end simply because one plot has failed. The hatred between House Atreides and House Harkonnen was older than any living man, a wound that ran back through generations to ancient betrayals. And the failure of the trap in Arrakis did not close that wound, but only inflamed it. In the fastness of Giedi Prime, that dark and joyless world of black stone and oil-stained skies, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen seethed at the news that Duke Leto still drew breath. His grand design, the careful web of treachery he had spun with the secret blessing of the Emperor himself, had torn at the last moment, and the prey he had thought already dead now stood upon Arrakis, alive and warned and watchful. But the Baron was not a man to fling himself into open rage, whatever the fires that burned in him. He was patient in his cruelty, subtle in his malice, a creature who preferred the poisoned cup to the drawn blade. And so began a slower kind of war, a long contest of wits and shadows played out across the dunes and in the halls of power, a war in which the Atreides could not afford a single misstep. Duke Leto understood this. He knew, as few men could have known so surely, exactly who had wished him dead and exactly why, and this terrible clarity became his shield. A man who knows the shape of his enemy's hatred can prepare for it, and Leto prepared. He did not answer the Baron's schemes with schemes of his own devising, at least not at first. He had learned from his near destruction that to match the Harkonnens' cruelty for cruelty was to fight them upon the ground they had chosen and knew best. Instead, he fought them with patience, with vigilance, with the slow and unglamorous labor of making his house too well guarded to strike. He drew his loyal men close about him and set them to the watching of every gate and every shadow. Thufir Hawat, whose mentat mind held the memory of every Harkonnen treachery, gave himself entirely to the untangling of the enemy's plots, following each thread of rumor and bribery to its source, and cutting it before it could bear its poisoned fruit. The Harkonnens tried again, of course. They tried in the ways they knew, the ways that had so nearly worked before. There were agents sent among the household staff, men and women bought with money or bent with fear, sent to find some crack in the Atreides' defenses through which death might be poured. But a house that has once been betrayed learns to watch for betrayal, and these agents found the ground far harder than they had expected. The loyal men of House Atreides had not forgotten the traitor who had opened the door on that terrible night, and they had sworn among themselves that no such door would ever open again. The watchfulness that grief might have made bitter was instead made careful, and the enemy's agents were found and quietly undone before they could complete their work. There were subtler assaults as well, for the Baron was nothing if not inventive in his malice. He worked to poison the reputation of House Atreides in the halls of the Landsraad, whispering that the Duke was weak, that his house was crumbling, that Arrakis was slipping from his grasp. He sought to strangle the flow of spice, arranging for equipment to fail and for supplies to go missing, hoping to make the Atreides appear incapable of holding the great prize the Emperor had granted them. For if the house could be made to seem a failure, then the Emperor might have cause to strip it of Arrakis and hand the planet back to Harkonnen hands, and the Baron would win by policy what he had failed to win by murder. Against these slower poisons, Leto set the slow medicine of good governance. He would not give the Baron the failure he sought. Where the enemy arranged for a harvester to fail, the Atreides repaired it and sent out 2 more. Where supplies went missing, the Duke found new sources and tightened his stores. Where whispers spread that his house was weak, he answered not with boasts, but with the quiet evidence of a planet worked well and a people governed fairly. He made House Atreides a model of steady competence, and steady competence is a difficult thing to slander, for the truth of it stands plain for all to see. The Emperor, watching from his distant throne, found no cause to move against a house that gave him no trouble and kept the spice flowing. There was wisdom, too, in the way Leto refused to be provoked. The Baron wished nothing more than to goad the Duke into some rash act, some open strike against Harkonnen interests that might be painted as aggression and used to justify a wider war. But Leto would not be goaded. When Harkonnen agents committed some outrage upon the sands, some small and calculated cruelty meant to sting, the Duke answered with measured firmness and never with fury. He punished what must be punished and let the rest pass, denying the Baron the spectacle of an enraged and reckless enemy. This restraint cost him something, for there is a hunger in every wronged man to strike back, and Leto felt that hunger as keenly as any. But he had learned that vengeance was a fire that consumed the one who carried it, and he chose instead the cooler and harder path of patience. Paul watched all of this and learned from it, as he learned from everything his father did. He saw how a great enemy might be held at bay not by a single decisive blow, but by the steady refusal to give that enemy any opening. He saw that strength was not always the loud thing the songs made it out to be, that sometimes the strongest act was to endure, to wait, to keep the house whole and give the foe nothing to seize upon. And he saw, in the lines that the years and the strain drew upon his father's face, what such patience cost, and he honored his father the more for paying it. The desert itself became an ally in this long contest. The Fremen, those watchful people of the deep sand whom the Baron had always despised and underestimated, had no love for Harkonnen rule, for they remembered the cruelties of the old Harkonnen governors with a bitterness that did not fade. As the Atreides showed themselves a different kind of ruler, the desert people watched with a growing and cautious interest, and their eyes upon the sands became a warning system no Harkonnen agent could evade. More than once a plot slipped into the deep desert was undone there by watchers the Baron never knew were watching, and the Duke, though he did not yet fully grasp the strength that was quietly gathering to his side, felt the shelter of it, and was glad. So the war of wits went on, season upon season, a contest without banners or trumpets, fought in the quiet spaces between open acts. The Baron schemed, and the Duke endured, and the balance held. The killing blow that had nearly fallen once was never allowed to fall again, held back not by any single victory, but by the ceaseless and patient vigilance of a house that had learned the price of a moment's inattention. It was not peace, exactly, for the enemy never slept, but it was safety, hard-won and carefully kept, and beneath its shelter the Atreides endured. Up next in Chapter 8, Jessica and a Quieter Peace, we'll turn to the Lady Jessica, the Bene Gesserit mother, who no longer flees alone into the deep desert, but stands beside a living Duke. Her fears eased and her family made whole. Of all those whose lives were changed by the survival of Duke Leto, perhaps none found a deeper transformation than the Lady Jessica. She was a woman shaped by hard disciplines and harder secrets, a daughter of the Bene Gesserit, trained from childhood in the sisterhood's long and patient arts, and she had come to House Atreides not as a wife, but as a bound concubine, given to the Duke by the order she served. Yet she had done what the sisterhood had never intended. She had loved him. Against all her training, against the cool detachment the Bene Gesserit prized above nearly everything, she had given her heart to Leto Atreides, and she had borne him a son, and in doing so, she had bent the careful breeding designs of her order to the shape of her own love. In the life that was never to be, this love would have been the source of her deepest grief. She would have watched her Duke fall to Harkonnen treachery, would have fled into the deep desert with her young son and the child not yet born within her, a fugitive and a widow, carrying her sorrow across the burning sands. She would have become something formidable in that other life, a reverend mother among the Fremen, a woman of terrible power and terrible loss. But she would have carried always the weight of the man she could not save. That was the fate the pattern had woven for her, and it was a fate of endurance purchased with unending pain. But the pattern had broken. Leto lived, and so the grief that had been prepared for her never came. Jessica found herself instead in a life she had scarcely dared to hope for, standing beside a living Duke, her son growing straight and whole under his father's hand, and the future that had once yawned before her as a chasm of loss now opening instead into something gentler. It took her time to trust it. A woman trained to see every shadow and calculate every danger does not easily set down her vigilance, and for many months Jessica moved through her days with the wary alertness of one who expects the ground to give way beneath her. But the ground held. Season followed season, and Leto lived, and slowly, cautiously, the Lady Jessica allowed herself to believe in her own good fortune. The easing of her fear was a slow tide, but it was a true one. She had lived so long braced against catastrophe that the absence of it felt at first almost like a kind of vertigo, a strange lightness she did not know how to hold. But as the months turned into years and the house remained whole, she found that lightness settling into something steadier, a quiet contentment she had never allowed herself to imagine. She watched her son at his lessons with his father and felt her heart unclench. She sat with Leto in the evenings and knew that he would be there in the morning, and the ordinary miracle of that certainty became the foundation upon which her peace was built. Her love for Leto, deepened in these years into something richer than the fierce and frightened thing it had been. In the shadow of constant danger, love is a desperate flame, burning hot against the dark. But in the shelter of safety, love may grow into something broader and calmer, a steady warmth rather than a desperate fire, and it was this that grew between Jessica and her Duke. They had come through the worst together and been spared, and those who survive such a thing side by side are bound by more than passion. They were bound by the shared knowledge of how nearly they had lost everything, and by the daily gratitude of having kept it. Yet Jessica did not forget what she was. The Bene Gesserit training did not fade merely because her fears had eased, and she remained ever the watchful mother, ever attentive to the strange gifts that stirred in her son. She had known from before his birth that Paul was no ordinary child, that the long breeding of her order had converged in him towards some purpose the sisterhood kept hidden even from her. She had seen the visions trouble his sleep, had watched the uncanny knowing surface in his eyes, and in another life, she would have had to guide him through the awakening of those powers alone, with no one to share the weight of what he was becoming. Now she did not carry that burden by herself. Now there was Leto beside her, and though the Duke did not fully understand the depths of what stirred in his son, his steady presence lightened the load for them both. This sharing changed the shape of Jessica's motherhood. Freed from the crushing solitude that her other fate would have imposed, she could be to Paul not only a teacher of the secret arts, but simply a mother, warm and present and unafraid. She could let him be a young man and not only an instrument of prophecy. And she found, in this freedom, that her own fears for him softened. The terrible futures that Paul sometimes glimpsed, the branching dark corridors of what might be, frightened her less when she saw how her son faced them with his father near. The visions felt less like a doom laid upon her child, and more like warnings he might yet learn to heed. And a mother can bear a warning far more easily than she can bear a doom. There was, too, a quiet healing in the way Jessica came to stand within the house itself. As a bound concubine, she had always occupied an uncertain place, loved by the Duke but never his wife, held apart by the politics that required Leto to keep himself free for some future marriage of alliance. That uncertainty had never entirely left her, a small cold thread woven through her days. But in the years of peace that followed Leto's survival, the Duke made plain in 100 small ways the place she held in his heart and in his house. And though the formalities of rank remained what they were, the substance of her position grew unshakable. She was the mother of his heir, the companion of his counsels, the one he turned to in the quiet hours, and no title could have made her more truly the lady of that house than she already was. And so the Lady Jessica came into a peace she had never been fated to know. It was not the grand and terrible destiny that the broken pattern had prepared for her, the fugitive reverend mother of the deep desert, mighty in her sorrow. It was something smaller and infinitely kinder. It was a family kept whole, a love allowed to ripen in safety, a son growing under the eyes of both his parents, and the slow unclenching of a heart that had braced too long against a grief that never came. She had defied her order by loving, and in this gentler world her defiance had not cost her everything, but had instead been rewarded with the one thing the Bene Gesserit had never taught her to seek, and had perhaps never truly understood. She had been given the simple and profound peace of a family made whole. Up next in Chapter 9, Paul learns to rule beside his father. We'll follow the young heir as he takes on the burdens of the house slowly and with support, shaped by a father's living example rather than a father's death. In the seasons that followed the night that did not end House Atreides, a quieter kind of change began to move through Arrakis. It was not the change of banners falling or towers burning. It was the slow, patient change of a boy growing into the shape of the man he would one day be, with a living father standing at his shoulder to steady each step. Paul Atreides was learning to rule, and he was learning it the way a river learns its course, gradually, gently, wearing its path into the stone of the world rather than blasting it open all at once. Duke Leto understood something that few men in his position ever have the fortune to understand. He knew that a house is not held by a single strong hand, but by the many hands that come after, and so he did not hoard his authority as a miser hoards coin. Instead, he began, little by little, to place small pieces of it into his son's keeping. A question of grain stores here, a dispute among the water sellers there, the wording of a message to a minor house that wished to trade. Each of these was a stone laid in the foundation of the young man Paul was becoming, and each was laid with care. The councils of Arrakis changed their tone in those seasons. Where once a boy might have sat silent at the edge of the table, listening and saying nothing, now there was a chair set for Paul near his father, and it was understood by all who gathered there that the words he spoke carried weight. He did not speak often at first. He had been taught by Thufir Hawat to watch before he moved, to gather the full shape of a thing before he laid his own hand upon it. And so, in those early councils, he mostly listened. He listened to the reeves who counted the spice. He listened to the officers who spoke of the deep desert and its dangers. He listened, and he learned the faces of the men his father trusted, and slowly the room learned his face in return. Leto watched his son with a feeling he could scarcely name, a warmth that sat behind his ribs like a small, steady coal. He remembered his own father, the old Duke, and the way the great man had died in the bullering under the horns of a Seleucid beast, leaving a young Leto to carry a house before he was truly ready. Leto had sworn in the private chambers of his own heart that his son would not be handed such a weight all at once and alone. He would give Paul the gift he himself had been denied, the gift of time, the gift of a father who lived long enough to teach. And so the teaching went on. Some of it happened in the councils, but much of it happened in the small hours between, when the two of them walked the halls of the residency together, and Leto spoke of the things that no council ever records. He spoke of the difference between fear and respect, and why a ruler who is only feared has already begun to lose. He spoke of the great houses of the Landsraad and their old grudges and older debts. He spoke of the way a single unwise word can undo a season of careful work, and the way a single kind one can bind a wavering ally close. Paul took these lessons in the way dry ground takes rain, quietly, deeply, without spectacle. There was a matter, one season, of a caravan of water that had gone missing between two of the Sink villages, and the loss had set the two settlements against each other, each certain the other had stolen what was owed. It was a small thing in the great accounting of a planet, but water on Arrakis is never truly a small thing, and Leto saw in it a chance. He set the matter in Paul's hands and told him only to be just, and to remember that justice heard by both sides is worth more than justice imposed upon them. Paul spent long days upon it. He sent for the record keepers of both villages. He walked the route the caravan had taken. He learned, in the end, that no one had stolen anything, that a shifting dune had swallowed the cistern cart and its drivers in a single quiet night, and that grief and suspicion had done the rest. He gave both villages a share of the ducal reserve to make good the loss, and he let them see that their duke's son had come himself to find the truth. The two settlements were bound closer to the house after that than they had ever been before, and Paul understood, walking home across the sand, that he had been given not a chore, but a teaching. Jessica watched all of this with the trained eye of the Bene Gesserit and the fuller heart of a mother, and she found that the two did not war within her, as she had once feared they might. She had been raised to see her son as a piece, in a design far larger than one family, a thread in a weaving that reached back countless generations. Yet here, in a house that had not fallen, she was permitted to see him also simply as her boy, growing straight and strong beside his father. And she allowed herself the quiet luxury of pride. She still schooled him in the ways she knew, the control of voice and breath and body, the reading of small signs, but she taught them now as gifts to strengthen a life, not as armor against a doom she could feel closing in. The weight of leadership, shared, became a thing that did not crush but rather steadied. Paul felt it settle across his shoulders season by season, and because it did not come all at once, and because there was always his father to turn to, he found that he could carry it and stand upright still. He made mistakes, as any young man must. He judged a merchant too harshly once, and had to be gently shown his error, and he bore the correction well because it came from a father and not from the cold indifference of the world. He grew, in those seasons, into someone the household began to trust not merely as the Duke's son, but as a man who might one day be Duke himself and be worthy of it. There were evenings when the two of them, father and son, would stand together on the high balconies of the residency and watch the desert take the last of the day's light. The sand would turn from gold to rose to a deep and gentle violet, and the first stars would prick the sky, and neither of them would feel any need to fill the quiet. In those moments, Leto felt the full measure of what had been spared them. In another telling, he knew somewhere in his bones this closeness might never have been. In another telling, the boy beside him might have been left alone to face a world that wanted him dead. But that was not this telling. In this telling, the father lived, and the son learned, and the house grew slowly stronger with each passing season, like a tree that has found good water at last and sends its roots down deep and sure. And Paul, for his part, came to understand that ruling was not the wielding of power, but the tending of it, the way one tends a fragile plant in a harsh land, shielding it, watering it, giving it time. He was learning to rule beside his father, and it was making of him something gentler and steadier than fate had ever meant him to be. Up next in Chapter 10, the Fremen as allies, not saviors, will walk out from the walls of Arrakis and into the deep desert, where Stilgar and his people come not to rescue a broken orphan, but to meet a living duke, and where a partnership of true respect begins to take root in the sand. Beyond the walls of Arrakis, past the last of the wind traps and the graves of the sink villages, the deep desert stretched away in ridge after ridge of moving sand, and there the Fremen lived as they had always lived, hidden in the rock, sparing of water, watchful of every stranger who dared their sea of dunes. In another telling, they would have found a fugitive boy and his mother stumbling out of the night, half broken by grief and flight, and they would have taken them in as the desert takes in the lost. But this was not that telling. In this telling, the Fremen came to House Atreides not as saviors of the fallen, but as equals meeting equals, and that single difference changed the whole shape of what grew between them. It began, as such things often do, with small meetings in quiet places. Leto had understood from his first days upon Arrakis that the true strength of the planet did not lie in the great cities or the spice yards or the garrisons of the Imperium. It lay out in the sand, among the desert folk whom the Harkonnens had hunted and despised, and never once thought to number rightly. Where the Harkonnens had seen vermin to be culled, Leto saw a people, disciplined and proud and vast beyond the reckoning of the Imperium. and he set himself to the patient work of earning their trust rather than commanding their obedience. Stilgar came first as a shadow among shadows, a naib of Sietch Tabr, sent to take the measure of this off-world duke who spoke of the Fremen as men and not as beasts. He came expecting the usual arrogance of the great houses, and he found instead a duke who rose to greet him, who spoke to him as one leader speaks to another, who did not flinch from the hard blue of his spice-stained eyes. Leto did not try to buy the Fremen with promises he could not keep. He offered instead something rarer, which was respect and the plain acknowledgement that upon Arrakis the Fremen were the true masters of the sand, and House Atreides only a guest upon it. The Fremen do not give their trust quickly. They had been betrayed too many times by too many offworlders to open their hearts at the first kind word. And so the alliance grew slowly, the way water gathers in a catch basin, drop by patient drop. Leto sent no soldiers into the desert to seize what they wanted. He sent instead men who would learn, ecologists and water workers who listened to the Fremen and treated their knowledge of the deep desert as the treasure it truly was. He honored their dead. He kept the water discipline they held sacred. When his people crossed Fremen ground, they crossed it as guests who asked leave, and the Fremen marked this and remembered it. Paul walked much of this path at his father's side, and for him the desert folk were not a strange people glimpsed from a distance, but companions in the making. He learned from them the way one learns a language by living inside it. He learned the walk without rhythm that does not call the great worms from the deep. He learned the wisdom of the still suit, the reclaiming of every drop of the body's moisture, the reverence for water that ran through every Fremen custom like a hidden river. He learned that a people the Imperium had dismissed as savages held within their sietches a discipline and a courage that no soft city could ever match. And the Fremen, watching this young man learn without arrogance, without the off-worlder's habit of thinking he already knew, began to warm to him in a way they had warmed to few outsiders before. Stilgar and Leto, in the slow seasons of their acquaintance, became something more than allies of convenience. There was between them a recognition of like to like. Two men who led by earning the loyalty of hard people. Two men who understood that authority given freely is worth 10 times authority seized by force. They did not always agree. The Fremen wished to move faster in their long dream of a green Arrakis, and Leto counseled patience, for the eyes of the Imperium were always upon the spice, and a change too swift would draw a scrutiny neither of them wanted. But even in their disagreements there was respect, and respect is the ground in which lasting alliances take root. The Fremen had a dream, whispered from generation to generation, of a day when the desert might bloom, when open water might lie under an open sky, when the plantings of the long ecological work of Pardat Kynes and his son Liet might at last turn the dust to grass and the grass to forest. In another telling, this dream would have been swept up into a whirlwind, seized by a Messiah and carried across the stars on a tide of blood. But here, in the gentler telling, the dream stayed what it had always been, a patient work of hands and generations, tended by the Fremen, and now aided by a house that honored it. Leto gave them what quiet help he could, and asked nothing in return but friendship, and the Fremen, unused to a great house that took less than it gave, drew closer to House Atreides with each passing season. Jessica too found her place in this slow weaving. She had been trained by the Bene Gesserit, and she knew the old seeds that the Order had scattered across the desert peoples long ago. The myths and expectations sown to shelter a sister of the sisterhood should she ever be stranded among them. In another life, she might have used those seeds, might have let the Fremen see in her and her son the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. and so bound them to a cause with the strong cords of faith. But she had no need to do so now. She stood beside a living Duke, in a house that had not fallen, and she chose instead to meet the Fremen as they were, honestly, without the machinery of myth. It was a harder road and a slower one, but it was a truer one, and the friendship it built stood on stone rather than on shadow. There came a time when a party of Harkonnen scouts pressed too far into the deep desert, hunting for the sea-etches they had never been able to find, and it was a joint effort of Atreides watchmen and Fremen guides that turned them back before they could do harm. It was a small action, quickly over, but it marked something. It was the first time the desert folk and the household had stood together against a common foe, and the standing together bound them as no treaty on paper ever could. The Fremen saw that this Duke's men would fight beside them and not merely command them from behind safe walls, and the household saw that the desert was full of allies where they had once seen only emptiness. So the alliance grew, not out of desperation, not out of the grief of the broken and the lost, but out of a slow and mutual respect that had time to deepen and to strengthen. The Fremen came to House Atreides as partners, keepers of the desert, who had chosen to share their sand with a house that had proven worthy of the honor. And in the quiet reckoning of years, this partnership of respect would prove stronger and gentler and longer lasting than any bond forged in the fire of a holy war. Up next in Chapter 11, Gurney, Duncan, and the loyal house will return within the warm walls of the Residency, where the scattered men of House Atreides gather once more around their Duke, and the sound of a balisette and the flash of a loyal blade tell of a household that never lost its heart. Within the warm walls of the Residency at Arrakis, in the seasons after the night that did not end the house, a slow and gladdening gathering took place. The men of House Atreides, scattered by the treachery that had so nearly undone them, came back one by one to the side of their Duke, drawn as iron filings are drawn to a lodestone, drawn by the simple and steadying fact that Leto Atreides still lived and his house still stood. And as they returned, the Residency filled again with the sounds and the warmth of a household that had come very close to losing its heart and had, against all the odds of that terrible night, kept it. Gurney Halleck came back to the halls of Arrakis with his balisette slung across his broad and scarred back, and the music came back with him. In the dark days after the attack, when the household had scattered and no one yet knew who had lived and who had fallen, Gurney had gathered the loyal remnants of the Atreides forces and held them together by sheer stubborn will, waiting for word, believing against reason that his Duke was not lost. When at last the word came that Leto lived, the troubadour warrior wept, though he would have denied it to any man who asked. And then he did what he always did in the face of joy and sorrow alike. He took up his instrument and he made music. The Residency had been a solemn place in the seasons of recovery, heavy with the memory of how near the house had come to ruin. But Gurney would not have it stay so. In the evenings, when the day's labor was done, the low notes of his balisette would begin to drift through the halls, and men who had not smiled in weeks would find themselves drawn toward the sound. He sang the old songs of Caledon, the songs of green hills and gray seas, and the slow rains that the desert folk of Arrakis could scarcely imagine. He sang of loyalty and of home, and sometimes he sang the rough and ribald songs of the barracks that set the young soldiers laughing until their sides ached. The music was medicine, and Gurney knew it, and he dosed the household with it freely, mending in the evenings the wounds that the days could not reach. Duncan Idaho came back as well, and with him came the steady certainty of a blade in a sure hand. Duncan was a swordmaster of the Jinnahs, and there were few finer in all the Imperium, but it was not only his skill that made him precious to the house. It was his heart, open and loyal and without guile. The heart of a man who had been raised up by House Atreides from nothing and who had sworn himself to it with every fiber of his being. In the confusion of the attack he had fought like a man possessed, and he had lived, and now he stood again at the door of his duke, and the household breathed easier for his presence. Where Duncan stood watch, men slept sound. Duncan took Paul under his wing in the way of a soldier and a friend, and the two of them spent long hours in the practice yards. Duncan taught the young man the finer points of the blade, the timing and the footwork, and the reading of an opponent's intent that no book could ever convey. But he taught him other things too, things that had no name in any manual of arms. He taught him what it meant to give one's loyalty freely and completely, to bind oneself to a cause not out of fear or hope of reward, but out of love. Paul, who was learning statecraft from his father and the desert from the Fremen, learned from Duncan the plain and unglamorous virtue of steadfastness, and it took root in him deep. Thufir Hawat, the old mentat and master of assassins, had cause in this telling for a grim satisfaction he rarely allowed himself to show. It was his long suspicion, his ceaseless calculation of every angle of threat, that had helped bring the warning a moment sooner on the night of the attack. He carried still the burden of the near disaster, turning it over in the vast machinery of his mind, tracing every thread of how the enemy had come so close, so that such a thing might never come so close again. He was old, and the sappho juice had stained his lips a deep cranberry, and the years lay heavy upon him. But his devotion to the house he had served across 3 generations of Atreides dukes had not dimmed by a single degree. He watched over Paul with the fierce and wary love of a man who had known the boy's father and grandfather both, and he was determined that this generation, at least, would not be taken. There were others too, the soldiers and the servants and the quiet functionaries who make a great house run, and they came back or they had never left, and together they wove again the fabric of a household. There was warmth in the residency in those seasons, a warmth that had been very nearly extinguished and now burned all the brighter for having been so close to going out. The men who had survived the treachery of that night felt bound to one another and to their duke by a bond that no ordinary peace could ever have forged. They had stood at the edge of ruin together, and they had drawn back from it together. And there is no closeness quite like the closeness of those who have shared such a night and lived. Leto moved among them as the heart of it all, and he did not take their loyalty for granted, not for a single day. He knew what he had, and he knew how nearly he had lost it, and he tended his household as a careful gardener tends a rare and precious growth. He learned the names of the soldiers' children. He sat sometimes in the evenings among the men, listening to Gurney's music, and he let them see that their duke was a man among them, and not only a lord above them. This was the old Atreides way, the way that had made men love the house of the Red Hawk across the generations, the way of loyalty freely given and freely returned, and Leto kept it faithfully. And Paul, watching all of this, learned perhaps the deepest lesson of his young life. He learned that a house is not its walls or its wealth or even its duke, but its people, the men and women who bind themselves to it and to one another. He saw in Gurney's music and Duncan's blade and Thufir's tireless watching the true and living strength of House Atreides, a strength that no army could buy and no treachery could wholly destroy. He came to understand that the loyalty he saw around him was a thing that had been earned across generations, and that it would fall to him one day to earn it anew in his turn and to keep faith with it as his father had. On the quietest evenings, when Gurney's baliset had fallen silent and the halls had gone still, The residency at Arrakis felt less like an outpost on a harsh and distant world, and more like a home. It was a house that had not lost its heart, and everyone who dwelt within its walls could feel the truth of that. A warmth against the cold of the desert night, a light that the darkness had reached for and failed to take. Up next in Chapter 12, The Spice Without the War, we'll follow the long caravans out to the spice sands, where the melange is gathered with patience and care, and where a duke steers the guild and the Imperium into a careful balance that brings prosperity without the terrible fire of a holy war. Out beyond the shield wall, where the open desert began and the great dunes marched away to the curve of the world, the harvest of the spice went on as it had gone on for uncounted years. And in this gentler telling, it went on without the shadow of the great war that might have been. The melange, the spice, the strange and precious substance that folded space and lengthened life and made the whole of the Imperium turn upon the axis of one desert world, was gathered here on Arrakis with patience and with care. And House Atreides worked the sands not as a conqueror wringing tribute from a broken land, but as a steward tending a trust. Leto had understood from the beginning that the spice was both the greatest gift and the greatest danger that Arrakis held. Whoever controlled the melange held a hand upon the throat of the Imperium, for without it, the guild navigators could not fold their great ships across the deeps of space, and without the ships, the 10,000 worlds of the Imperium would drift apart into isolation and darkness. This was a power almost too great to be borne, and Leto knew that to wield it clumsily, greedily, or in anger was to invite destruction, and so he chose instead to wield it with the lightest and most careful of hands. The harvesting itself was a slow and dangerous art, and Leto insisted that it be done with respect, both for the men who did it and for the desert that yielded it. The spotters flew their ornithopters out over the sand, watching for the telltale blooms of color that marked a spice deposit rising, watching too for the far more dangerous sign, the great swelling ridge of sand and the vast approach of a maker. One of the enormous worms that the Fremen held sacred and that the harvesters feared above all things. When a worm came, and a worm always came, drawn without fail to the rhythmic thumping of the machinery, the great crawlers had to be lifted clear by the carrioles before the maker took them down into the deep. It was work that lived always at the edge of danger, and Leto valued the men who did it, and lost fewer of them than the Harkonnens ever had, because he spent on their safety what the Harkonnens had always begrudged. Where the Harkonnens had torn the spice from Arrakis with a brutal greed, careless of the men they used up and the desert they scarred, the Atreides way was different, and the difference was felt across the whole enterprise. Leto worked the sands with care. He did not drive his harvesters to ruin for the sake of a fuller quota. He listened to the Fremen and to the ecologists in the matter of where the spice lay and how the desert should be treated, and he found that a lighter hand often yielded not less, but more. For men who are valued work better than men who are used, and a land that is tended gives more freely than a land that is stripped. The spice flowed steadily from Arrakis under the Atreides banner, and it flowed without the endless bleeding of lives that had marked the Harkonnen years. The balance that Leto kept was a delicate thing, and he tended it as carefully as any harvester ever watched for the coming of a worm. There was the Spacing Guild, which needed the melange above all else and cared for little else, and which watched the flow of spice from Arrakis with the cold and calculating patience of an institution that measured its interests in centuries. There was the Padishah Emperor upon his golden lion throne, who held the ultimate authority of the Imperium and who watched any great house that grew too strong with a jealous and wary eye. There were the other great houses of the Landsraad, the assembly of the noble families, each with its own ambitions and its own grudges. each watching Arrakis and the spice with hungry attention. And there were the Harkonnens, ever plotting, ever waiting, held at bay but never truly gone. To keep all of these in balance, to give none of them cause to strike, and all of them reason to let the arrangement stand, was a work of statecraft as fine as any ever practiced in the Imperium. And Leto practiced it season upon season with a patience that never faltered. He was scrupulous in his dealings with the Guild, meeting every obligation, giving the navigators no cause for complaint, for he knew that the Guild's favor was a shield and its displeasure a doom. He was careful with the Emperor, sending the tribute that was due, offering no challenge, giving the throne no pretext to move against a house that had already, in another telling, come so near to falling. He was patient with the Landsraad, binding minor houses to him with fair trade and honest dealing, building slowly the web of alliances that would make House Atreides too well loved and too well connected to be struck down easily in the dark. And all the while the spice flowed, and the wealth of it flowed with it, and House Atreides grew quietly and steadily stronger without ever once reaching for more than it could safely hold. In another telling, this careful balance would have shattered. In another telling, the spice would have become the fuel of a holy war, its flow seized and threatened and turned into a weapon, and the desert would have burned with a fire that spread from Arrakis across the whole of the Imperium and consumed untold billions in its passing. But that was not this telling. In this telling, the spice remained what it had always been meant to be, a treasure to be shared under careful terms, the lifeblood of a peaceful commerce that bound the worlds together rather than a torch to set them all alight. There was prosperity on Arrakis in those seasons, a quiet and growing prosperity, and it came without the Great War, and that was the whole of the miracle of it. Paul learned the working of the spice as he learned everything else in those seasons, at his father's side and with his father's patience. He flew out over the sands and the ornithopters and watched the harvest with his own eyes, and he came to understand the delicate machinery of interests and obligations that his father tended so carefully. He saw how a single misstep, a quota missed, a tribute withheld, a slight given to the Guild, might bring the whole careful structure crashing down. And he learned that the true art of it was not in the seizing, but in the balancing, in the patient holding of many forces, in a state of quiet equilibrium, so that the spice might flow, and the house might prosper, and the peace might hold. The desert, for its part, gave up its treasure and endured, worked with a care it had not known under harsher masters. The Fremen watched the Atreides harvest their sacred sands and saw that it was done with respect, and they were glad of it. The spice flowed, the balance held, and Arrakis in those seasons knew a prosperity without a war. A gentler path through the melange than fate had ever meant for it, tended by a duke wise enough to take from the desert only what the desert could freely give. Up next in Chapter 13, Chani and Paul, a gentler meeting, will follow the young heir of House Atreides out among the people of the sand, where in a time of peace and without the desperation of exile, he meets a young woman of Arrakis, and a tender and unhurried courtship begins. There is a kind of meeting that happens only in peaceful times, when no one is running, when no one is afraid, when the future does not press its cold hand against the shoulders of the young. In another life, in a harsher telling of these same days, Paul Atreides and the Fremen girl called Chani might have found each other in the deep desert, in the middle of grief and flight, two survivors clinging together against the dark. But that is not how it happened here. Here, in a time of quiet, in a house that had not fallen, they came to know each other slowly, the way sand settles, the way water finds its level, gently and without haste. It began in the great courts of Arrakis, where the desert people had begun to come and go more freely now that a living duke honored them. Chani came among a party of Fremen who had traveled up from the southern Sietches to speak of water and of trade, of the careful business that bound the desert folk to the house that ruled from the stone city. She was the daughter of Liet, the child of the planetologist whom the Fremen revered, and she carried in her the quiet strength of her people, the economy of movement, the stillness that the desert teaches to those who survive it. Her eyes were the deep blue of the spice, blue within blue, and they missed very little. Paul, for his part, had grown used to watching the Fremen with a careful, respectful attention. His father had taught him that these were not servants and not savages, but the true masters of the planet, the ones who knew its every secret. So when Paul first saw Chani in the long hall, he did not see a stranger to be charmed or a subject to be commanded. He saw someone who belonged to Arrakis in a way that he himself was only beginning to learn. And she, glancing across the hall at the young heir of the off-world house, saw not the pale weakling she might have expected, but a boy who watched and listened, who held himself with a stillness that echoed her own. They were not thrown together by disaster. No ambush drove them into the same cave. No shared thirst forced their trust. Instead, they met again and again, over the slow turning of many weeks, in the ordinary rhythm of a house at peace. Paul would come to the councils where the Fremen elders spoke, and he would sit quietly and learn, and Chani would be there, and afterward they would find themselves walking the cool corridors together, or standing at a high window where the great desert stretched golden and endless to the horizon. There was no need to hurry anything. Time, for once, was on their side. She began to teach him small things, the way one shares small gifts, how to read the color of the distant dunes for the hour of the day, how the wind carried the smell of spice before a blow, how the Fremen measured a person not by their words, but by the way they husbanded their water and their strength. Paul listened with a hunger that pleased her, for he did not pretend to know what he did not know, and there is no greater flattery to a desert dweller than the honest attention of someone willing to learn. In turn, he told her of the green worlds he had come from, of oceans that no Fremen had ever seen, of rain that fell from the sky freely and asked nothing in return. She found it hard to believe, and harder to imagine, and yet she loved the telling of it. There was in their friendship none of the desperation that fear breeds. When two people meet in catastrophe, their bond is forged in a furnace, quick and fierce and half made of terror. But when two people meet in peace, the bond grows the way a plant grows in a hidden garden, slowly, root by root, until one day it is simply there, strong and quiet and undeniable. Paul did not need Chani to survive. Chani did not need Paul to be saved. And because neither needed the other for rescue, what grew between them was something rarer, a choosing rather than a clinging, an affection given freely by two people who could have walked away and chose instead to stay. Jessica watched all of this with a mother's careful eye, and she was glad. In another life she might have feared for her son, might have seen in a Fremen attachment a complication, a danger, one more thread in a web she could not fully control. But her fears had eased in this gentler world. She saw how Chani steadied Paul, how the girl's desert calm answered something restless in him. And she saw, too, how Paul brought a lightness to the young woman, a curiosity about the wider universe that the hard life of the Sayach had never allowed. Leto, when he noticed, said little, but he watched his son and the Fremen girl with a quiet warmth, for he understood that a house which married its heart to the desert would be a house that endured. The Fremen themselves were watchful, as they were watchful of everything, but they were not displeased. Chani was no fool, and her people trusted her judgment. That she found the young Atreides worthy of her time told them something about him that no treaty could tell. Among the desert folk, Respect was a currency more precious than water, and Paul was earning it not through his name, but through his patience, his willingness to sit low and listen, his refusal to speak until he understood. Stilgar, who missed nothing, noted the way the boy and the girl walked together, and he tucked the observation away, for he knew that alliances between houses were sometimes sealed not in council chambers, but in the quiet spaces between two young hearts. And so the courtship, if such a slow and unspoken thing could even be called that, unfolded without prophecy pressing upon it. Paul still had his dreams, the strange visions that came to him in sleep and sometimes in waking. But with his father alive and the house secure, they did not carry the weight of doom they might otherwise have carried. When he dreamed of Chani, as he sometimes did, the dreams were gentle ones, not the anguished visions of a woman lost to war and grief, but simple images of the two of them beneath the desert stars, at peace. He did not know, in those days, how easily it might have gone otherwise. He only knew that when he was near her, the churning of his gifted mind grew quiet, and the endless branching futures narrowed to a single warm present that asked nothing of him but that he be there. There would be time, later, for whatever their two lives were meant to become. For now there was only the slow pleasure of knowing each other, the unhurried gift of days that stretched ahead without threat. In the evenings, the light on the dunes turned from gold to rose to the deep blue of dusk, and the first stars appeared over the sand. And two young people of Arrakis stood together at a high window and watched the desert breathe, and neither felt the need to say a single word. Peace had given them this. Peace, and a duke who had not died, and a house that had not fallen, and a world that had, for once, not demanded that its children pay in grief for the right to love. Up next in Chapter 14, the Emperor's watchful eye will drift far from the tender quiet of Arrakis to the distant throne of the Padishah Emperor, and feel how a ruler's jealousy can simmer across the void, and how a wise duke learns to give a suspicious crown no cause to strike. Far from the golden dunes of Arrakis, far from the quiet halls of Arrakeen, where a young man and a desert girl watched the evening settle over the sand, there sat a throne, and upon that throne sat a man who was not at peace. The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, ruler of the known universe, master of 1,000 worlds, held in his hands more power than any single person had ever held. And yet, he was troubled, for in the older, darker telling of these events, the emperor had rid himself of a rival by lending his own dread soldiers to the enemies of House Atreides, and the deed had been done, and Duke Leto had fallen. But in this gentler world, the trap had failed, the Duke had lived, and now the Emperor sat upon his throne and knew that the man he had wished dead was still very much alive. It is a strange thing to fear someone you have already tried to destroy. The Emperor had committed himself, quietly and deniably, to the ending of House Atreides. He had loaned his Sardaukar, the terrible legions, who fought with a fury no ordinary soldier could match, and he had lent them under cover of the Harkonnen banner so that no blame could ever reach his own hand. When the plan collapsed, when word came across the dark that the Duke had survived and the plot had unraveled, the Emperor did not rage. He was too subtle for rage. Instead, he grew quiet and watchful and uneasy, and that unease settled into him like sand into the seams of a garment, working its way deeper with every passing day. His fear had a name, and the name was popularity. Duke Leto Atreides had been beloved across the Landsraad, the great assembly of noble houses, and that love had been precisely the thing that made him dangerous. A cruel lord could be tolerated, even ignored, for cruel lords made enemies who kept them weak. But a just and generous duke, a man whose soldiers would die for him, and whose name was spoken with warmth in 100 courts. Such a man could gather allies without even trying. Such a man could, in time, become a rival for the throne itself. And now that man had survived an attempt on his life that carried, however faintly, the fingerprints of the imperial house. The emperor understood that Leto surely knew, or at least suspected, who had truly moved against him. And a duke who knew, and who lived, and who was loved, was a duke to be watched with great care. So the emperor watched. He did not strike again, not at once, for a second attempt so soon after the first would be clumsy, and might reveal what the first had been careful to hide. Instead, he sent his eyes and his ears. He sent envoys with silken words and observant gazes, men and women trained to notice everything and to report it faithfully to the throne. He read every dispatch that came from Arrakis with a new attention, searching the dry accounts of spice yields and trade agreements for any hint that the Atreides Duke was growing too strong, gathering too many friends, reaching too high. He consulted his truthsayer, the Bene Gesserit woman, who could hear a lie in any voice, and he turned over in his mind the long, patient calculus of how a threat might be managed without the risk of open war. And here is where the wisdom of Duke Leto proved its worth. For the Duke understood the Emperor's mind as clearly as if he could read it upon the imperial brow. Leto knew that he had survived not into safety, but into a new and more delicate danger. He knew that a wounded predator is most cautious just after its prey escapes, and that the surest way to invite a second blow was to appear to be preparing one of his own. So the Duke did something that required more strength than any charge into battle. He made himself small. He made himself patient. He made himself, to all outward appearance, exactly the loyal and unambitious vassal that a nervous emperor most wished to see. He paid his tributes on time and in full. He sent to the imperial court reports so scrupulously honest and so tediously complete that no reader could find in them a single hidden barb. He spoke of the emperor always with respect, and he made certain that this respect was spoken not only in the private letters that might be forged, but in the open councils where his own people could hear him and carry the word abroad. He took no action that could be read as a bid for greater power. He formed no grand alliance that might frighten the throne. When other houses of the Landsraad, sensing a rising star, sent quiet feelers toward Arrakis, hoping to bind themselves to a duke who had survived the impossible, Leto received them with courtesy and gave them nothing they could use, nothing the Emperor's spies could point to and call conspiracy. This was not weakness. It was the deepest kind of strength, the strength that knows how to wait. Leto understood that time was his ally, that every quiet year which passed without incident made the memory of that treacherous night grow fainter, made the Emperor's fear cool by another small degree. A house that survived and then behaved with perfect propriety became, over time, simply a fact of the imperial order, a fixture too settled and too well behaved to be worth the enormous cost and risk of a second attempt. The Duke meant to make himself into exactly such a fixture, dull and dependable and impossible to justify destroying. He taught this lesson to his son as well, for Paul would one day have to play the same careful game. Leto explained, in the long, quiet evenings, how the strong survive not by displaying their strength, but by knowing when to conceal it. He spoke of the Emperor not with hatred, but with a clear and unsentimental understanding, as a man speaks of the weather, something powerful and dangerous that must be respected and accommodated rather than fought. Paul listened, and he understood, and he felt the strange gratitude of a son learning statecraft from a father who, in another life, he would have had to learn everything alone, and far too late. And so across the great distance between the imperial throne and the desert world, a silent contest played out. A contest of patience and perception. The Emperor watched, waiting for the Atreides Duke to make the ambitious move that would justify his destruction. And the Duke, knowing he was watched, simply never made it. He gave the throne nothing. He offered no provocation, no insult, no reach toward power that could not be innocently explained. Year by year, the tension held at its careful distance, neither side willing to break the fragile peace. The Emperor unwilling to strike without cause, the Duke unwilling ever to give one. It was a balance as delicate as a grain of sand upon the edge of a knife, and Leto held it there through the sheer patient discipline of a mind that had looked into the abyss and chosen, ever after, to walk with great care along its rim. Up next in Chapter 15, A Duke's Wisdom Against the Dark, we'll draw closer to Leto himself and watch how one thoughtful man turned enemies aside and bound allies near, steering his whole house away from the catastrophe that once consumed it, choosing patience over vengeance at every turn. There is a wisdom that belongs only to those who have stood at the edge of ruin and stepped back. Duke Leto Atreides had felt the breath of his own death upon that terrible night in Arrakis, had felt the trap close, and then, by the narrowest margin, failed to hold him. A lesser man might have emerged from such a brush with the dark hungry for revenge, burning to strike back at the Baron who had schemed against him and the Emperor who had lent the schemers his soldiers. But Leto was not a lesser man. He emerged instead with a clarity that revenge could never have given him, an understanding that the surest way to honor his own survival was not to spend it chasing vengeance, but to use it to build something that could not so easily be destroyed. The dark had many faces, and the Duke learned to recognize each of them. There was the near dark of the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, the old enemy who still schemed from his own strongholds, still hungry for the wealth of Arrakis and the ruin of the house that had taken it from him. There was the far dark of the imperial throne, the cold suspicion that watched from across the void. And there was the subtler dark that lived within reach of any powerful house, the temptation to answer treachery with treachery, cruelty with cruelty, until the house that had been wronged became indistinguishable from the enemies who had wronged it. Leto set himself against all three, and he did it not with fire, but with patience. The way a desert traveler survives, not by fighting the sun, but by understanding it. Against the Baron, Leto practiced a war of wits so quiet that the Baron himself could scarcely tell it was being waged. He did not send assassins into Harkonnen halls, for that would only invite the same in return, and confirm to the Emperor that the Atreides were as dangerous as feared. Instead, he starved the Baron of the things he needed most. He strengthened the loyalty of his own people so completely that no Harkonnen bribe could find purchase among them. He made his house so honest in its dealings with the Guild and the great trading combine that no rival could undercut him or turn his partners against him. He gathered intelligence patiently, learning the Baron's plans before they ripened, so that each Harkonnen scheme met, upon arrival, a door already quietly locked and barred. The Baron flailed and plotted and spent his strength against defenses that never seemed to be there until the moment they were needed, and slowly, over the years, his schemes grew fewer and his frustration grew greater, and the threat that had once been mortal dwindled into a persistent but manageable nuisance. Against the far dark of the Emperor, Leto practiced the discipline of restraint that he had learned to make his shield. He gave the throne nothing to fear and nothing to punish. But restraint alone was not enough, for a house that merely crouched and hoped to be overlooked would eventually be overlooked into weakness. So the Duke did more. He wove his house quietly into the fabric of the imperial order in ways that made him useful rather than threatening. He ensured that the spice flowed reliably from Arrakis, that the great machinery of empire never wanted for the melange upon which it depended, that the emperor and the guild alike came to rely upon Atreides' stewardship of the desert world. A house that can be destroyed without cost is a house in danger. A house whose destruction would cost the destroyer dearly is a house that is safe. Leto made himself indispensable, and in indispensability he found a shield stronger than any wall. And against the subtle inner dark, the temptation toward cruelty and vengeance, Leto set the example of his own character. And this was perhaps the hardest battle of the three. It would have been easy, and in some cold way satisfying, to answer the treachery he had suffered with treachery of his own. His people would have followed him. His grief and his anger were entirely justified. But Leto understood a truth that few rulers ever grasp, that a house takes on the character of the one who leads it, and that a duke who ruled by fear and vengeance would raise up a house of fear and vengeance, a house that would rot from within long before any enemy could bring it down. So he chose, again and again, the harder and slower path. He kept his word even when breaking it would have been convenient. He treated his defeated enemies with more mercy than they deserved, and more than they would ever have shown him, not out of weakness, but because mercy binds where cruelty only breeds new hatreds. He honored the Fremen of the desert as true partners, rather than exploiting them as the Harkonnens had, and in doing so, he won an ally whose loyalty no amount of Harkonnen gold could ever buy. This binding of allies was the bright half of the Duke's statecraft, the necessary companion to his turning aside of enemies. For a house cannot survive on defense alone. It must have friends, and friends must be earned, and Leto understood that the deepest loyalty is not bought but grown. He drew the desert people close through respect, through fair dealing, through the simple radical act of keeping every promise he made to them. He drew the wavering houses of the Landsraad close not through grand alliances that would frighten the throne, but through 1,000 small kindnesses and honest exchanges that, over the years, built a quiet web of goodwill stretching across the empire. When the day came that Leto needed friends, he would find that he had them, not because he had bought them in a moment of crisis, but because he had earned them patiently across many peaceful years. He shared all of this with Paul, for the Duke knew that wisdom which dies with a single man is wisdom wasted. In the long evenings, they would sit together, the aging Duke and his growing son, and Leto would trace for the boy the whole careful architecture of his statecraft, explaining not only what he did, but why. He taught Paul that vengeance is a fire that consumes the one who carries it. He taught him that patience is not passivity, but the most active discipline of all, the constant, vigilant work of choosing the long path over the short one. He taught him that a great house is not a fortress of stone, but a fabric of trust, woven thread by thread over generations, and that a single act of betrayal or cruelty could unravel what a lifetime of honor had built. Paul absorbed these lessons the way the desert absorbs rain, greedily, gratefully, storing them deep for the day he would need them. And so, year by patient year, Leto steered his house away from the abyss that had once swallowed it whole. The catastrophe that in another life had consumed House Atreides, the fall, the flight, the fire that spread from one murdered duke across 100 worlds, none of it came to pass. It was turned aside not by force of arms, but by force of character, by a man who had looked into the dark and understood that the only sure defense against it was to refuse, absolutely and always, to become a part of it himself. The desert that surrounded him took its toll from the careless and the cruel, but it spared those who understood it, and Leto had come to understand a great deal. Up next, in Chapter 16, Paul comes of age. We'll turn to the son who grew up under this steady guidance and see how his strange and growing gifts unfolded with a father beside him, so that the terrible futures he glimpsed felt less like chains of fate and more like warnings he might yet learn to turn aside. A boy becomes a man slowly, in 1,000 small increments, and only rarely in a single dramatic hour. Paul Atreides came of age not in the crucible of catastrophe, but in the steady warmth of a house at peace. And this made all the difference in the world. His gifts were the same gifts he would have had in any telling of these events, for the strange powers that stirred within him came from his blood and his training, and the deep workings of the desert itself, and no gentleness of circumstance could have kept them from waking. But the same fire burns differently, depending on the vessel that holds it, and Paul held his growing powers in a vessel steadied by a father's presence, and so what might have been a terror became instead a strength he could learn to carry. The visions had begun in his boyhood and grew stronger as he grew. They came to him in dreams, and sometimes in the waking hours, sudden openings in the curtain of time, glimpses of things that had not yet happened and might never happen. He saw faces he had not yet met and places he had not yet walked. He saw, sometimes, terrible things, futures full of fire and grief, endless columns of the dead, a green banner carried across the stars by armies chanting a name that was his own. These were the same dark futures that in another life had haunted him nearly to madness, the same appalling possibilities branching out from every choice. The visions did not spare him simply because his father lived. The universe was still vast and still dangerous, and Paul's gifted eyes could still see the roads that led into darkness. But here was the difference, the quiet miracle of it. In another life, orphaned and hunted, Paul had faced these visions alone. A boy thrust into a destiny with no one to steady him, no elder hand to help him bear the unbearable weight of seeing too much. The visions had come to feel like fate, like a great current sweeping him toward horrors he could not prevent, and in his loneliness and grief he had come to believe that the terrible futures were not merely possible, but somehow required, the price of his survival and his power. Alone, a young mind can convince itself that the darkest road is the only road. But Paul was not alone. Paul had his father. And so when the visions came, Paul did not have to carry them in silence. He could bring them to Leto, could describe the terrible things he had seen, and his father would listen with the grave attention that only a father can give. Leto did not dismiss the visions as dreams, for he had lived long enough on Arrakis to know that the spice opened doors in the mind that could not be explained away. But neither did he treat them as chains. He treated them, instead, as intelligence, as warnings, as the reports of a scout returned from dangerous country. A vision of catastrophe, in Leto's hands, became not a prophecy to be dreaded, but a map of the roads to be avoided. If Paul saw a future full of fire, then together they would study the choices that led toward that fire, and they would choose, deliberately and patiently, to walk the other way. This changed everything about how Paul understood his own gift. Under his father's guidance, he came to see that the futures he glimpsed were not a single fixed doom, but a vast branching tree of possibilities, and that human choice was the hand that pruned that tree, closing some branches and opening others. The terrible green banner, the chanting armies, the numberless dead. These were real possibilities, but they were only possibilities, and they grew from particular roots, from particular choices made in particular moments of fear and grief. Remove those roots, make different choices. Refuse the paths of vengeance and desperation, and the dark futures withered before they could bloom. Paul learned to read his visions, not as sentences passed upon him, but as questions put to him, each one asking which road he would choose. Leto taught him, too, the discipline of not looking too far. For Paul discovered that the deeper he peered into the branching futures, the more they multiplied, until the sheer weight of possibility threatened to crush the mind that beheld it. A young prophet, alone, might drown in that ocean of futures, might lose himself so completely in what might be that he could no longer act in what was. But Leto, who had spent his life balancing the demands of the present against the pull of 100 imagined tomorrows, taught his son to hold the visions at a careful distance. He taught Paul to take from them what was useful, the warnings, the dangers, the opportunities, and then to set them aside and return to the solid ground of the present moment, where real choices were made and real lives were lived. This was perhaps the greatest gift the Father gave the Son, the gift of remaining human in the face of powers that might have carried him beyond humanity altogether. Grounded in this way, Paul grew into his strength without being consumed by it. His training with the Bene Gesserit, disciplines his mother had taught him, sharpened his mind and his body to an edge few could match. His years among the Fremen, learning their ways in peace rather than in desperate exile, gave him a deep and genuine knowledge of the desert and its people. His studies at his father's side gave him the statecraft and the patience to rule. And his visions, tamed and understood, gave him a strategic sight that no ordinary leader could possess, the ability to glimpse the consequences of choices before they were made. He was becoming, without the anguish that had once attended it, something remarkable, a young man of extraordinary gifts who nonetheless remained grounded, whole, and sane. Those around him noticed the change in him as he came into his full growth. Jessica saw in her son a serenity she had feared he might never possess, a steadiness that eased the deep maternal worry she had carried since his birth. Chani, who had come to know him in the gentle way of peaceful times, saw a young man growing into his strength without hardening into something cold or strange. The loyal men of the house, Gurney and Duncan and the others, saw an heir worthy of the Duke they served, and they gave him their respect freely. And Leto, watching his son come of age, felt a quiet joy that in another life he would never have lived to feel. The joy of a father who sees his child grow strong and good and knows that the house will be safe in his hands. Paul, for his part, understood in some deep way how much he owed to the simple fact of his father's survival. He knew, from his visions, something of the other life he might have lived, the orphaned life, the hunted life, the life in which he became a reluctant messiah riding a wave of holy war he could not control. He glimpsed that road sometimes in his dreams, and he shuddered at it, and then he opened his eyes to the peaceful reality around him and felt a gratitude so large it had no words. He had his father. He had his gifts, but he had them without their curse. He faced the terrible futures, but he faced them with a hand to hold and a wise voice to counsel him. And so the futures felt less like fate and more like warnings, less like chains and more like the choices of a free man who could still, even now, decide which road to walk. Up next, in Chapter 17, The Holy War That Never Came, will follow the greatest consequence of all these gentle choices, the jihad that once burned across the stars now left unlit, the countless lives that were spared, and a young man who became, instead of a reluctant messiah, simply the good heir of a good house. In another telling of this same story, a fire had begun on Arrakis and had not stopped burning until it had crossed the whole of the known universe. In that other telling, a boy who had lost his father took up a banner he never wanted, and the desert people, fierce and faithful, carried his name outward like a flame carried on the wind. Worlds beyond counting had felt that fire. In that other telling, The number of the dead had risen past all comprehension, past sorrow, past the reach of any single mourning heart, until it became only a figure spoken softly. 61 billion. A number so vast it ceased to mean anything a person could hold. That was the jihad. That was the holy war that might have been. And in this gentler telling, under this kinder sky, it never came. It did not come because the thing that would have lit it never happened. A fire of that kind needs a spark, and the spark had always been grief. A young man alone, a father dead, a house destroyed, a boy fleeing into the deep sand with nothing left to lose, and a terrible gift blooming inside him. From that particular sorrow, the flame had leapt. But here the father lived. Here the house still stood. Here the boy grew into a young man with his father at his side, and so the grief that would have kindled the war was never struck. Paul Atreides carried his strange gifts. Yes, the visions still came to him in the night, but he had not been hollowed out and refilled with vengeance. He had not been made into a vessel for 100 generations of desperate hope. He remained, quietly and simply, an heir to a good house. It is a strange thing to speak of a war that did not happen, for how does one mourn what was spared? The billions who would have died went on living, and none of them knew it. They rose in the mornings on their scattered worlds and drew water and tended their fields and quarreled and forgave and slept, and not one of them ever felt the shadow that had passed them by. That is the quiet mercy of a fire unlit. No one thanks the rain that did not become a flood. No one blesses the calm that never turned to storm. The saved go on unknowing, and that is exactly what it means to be saved. And perhaps that is the truest kindness of all, that the greatest gift a person can be given is often one they will never see, never name, and never have cause to thank anyone for. The billions lived out their lives in full, each one a whole world of hopes and small daily concerns, and the story of how narrowly they had all been spared was known to no one but a single young man on a single desert world who kept it quietly to himself. Paul understood this better than anyone alive, for he alone had seen the other path. In the folds of his awareness there lay the memory of a future that would not be, and it lay there the way an old wound lies quiet in a body that has healed. Sometimes, in the still hours, he would feel it. He would see the green banners and the burning cities and the roads of the desert people spilling out across the stars in his name. He would see himself lifted up as something more than a man and less than a man, worshipped and feared, unable to stop the thing he had begun. And then he would open his eyes to the plain walls of his father's house on Arrakis and hear the wind moving over the dunes, and know that the vision was only a warning he had heeded, a door he had seen and chosen not to walk through. His father had helped him understand this, though the older man could not see the futures as his son could. Leto had lived long enough to know the shape of grief and what it does to those who are broken by it too young. He had watched, in his own life, how quickly sorrow curdles into a hunger for retribution, and how that hunger, once fed, is never full. And so, he had done the one thing that mattered most. He had stayed alive. He had stayed present. He had let his son lean on him through the years when the boy most needed leaning, so that the strange power growing inside Paul had a steady frame to grow around, and did not have to become the whole of him. There is a way of thinking about a person that says the soul is a house, and that a house needs walls to hold its shape. A young man without a father is a house without one of its load-bearing walls, and the roof may hold for a time, but under great weight it will come down. Paul had kept that wall. And so, when the great weight came, when the visions pressed on him, and the desert people looked to him with eyes full of longing, and the whole architecture of prophecy leaned toward him, wanting him to become the thing it had waited so long for. He did not collapse into it. He held his shape. He was a man, and the son of a man, and he refused with quiet stubbornness to become a legend. The Fremen felt the difference, though they could not have named it. In the other telling, they had followed a Messiah, and there is no arguing with a people who believe. But here, they had come to know a young man of House Atreides, who walked among them without demanding worship, who learned their ways as a student learns from a teacher, and who spoke of the desert with love rather than with the fever of prophecy. Some among them still watched him closely, for the old legends the Bene Gesserit had seeded long ago still whispered in the sietches, still murmured of one who would come. But the fever never took. A living duke stood behind the young man, and a house that dealt fairly, and a peace that gave the desert people something better than a war to die in. It gave them a future to live in. Even the melange, the spice around which all the schemes of the Imperium turned, flowed on in its quiet way without the holy fire to consume it. There was no burning of the great houses, no toppling of the throne, no dark procession across the heavens. There was only Arrakis, worked with care, its riches gathered and traded and balanced against the wary interests of the guild and the emperor and the Landsraad. The universe went on turning as it always had, dense with rivalry and old grudges and small cruelties, but it did not catch fire. And that, in the end, was the whole of the miracle. Not that everything became perfect, but that the one terrible thing did not happen. On the quietest nights, when the twin moons hung over the dunes and the cold came down clean and sharp, Paul would sometimes go up onto the high places alone and look out over the sea of sand. He would feel the enormity of what had not come to pass, the 61 billion who lived because a fire was never lit, and he would feel the weight of it settle on him like a hand on the shoulder, not heavy but sure. He had not saved them by any great deed. He had saved them, if he had saved them at all, simply by being allowed to remain a person. And below him in the house his father slept, an old man now, breathing softly in the dark, the load-bearing wall still standing. The war that never came made no sound at all. That was how you knew it had truly been spared. The desert kept its silence, and the young man went back down the stair to sleep, and the stars turned on above a universe that would never know how close it had come, and never need to. Up next, in Chapter 18, An Old Duke and a Grown Son, we will sit with the long, gentle passage of the years, and see how a father growing old in peace and a son grown into his full strength came together to build what neither of them could ever have built alone. Years pass differently in a house that is at peace. In a house at war, time is measured in alarms and losses, in the sharp punctuation of disaster, and it seems to move both too fast and not at all. But in a house that has been given the gift of ordinary years, time softens and lengthens and becomes a thing you can almost forget to count. So it was for House Atreides on Arrakis, in this gentler telling, as the seasons of the desert turned over one another, and the boy who had grown into a young man grew further still, into a man in his full strength, while the Duke who had been spared grew slowly and peacefully old. Leto Atreides aged the way a stone aged, weathering rather than breaking. The years pressed their marks into him. His dark hair went to iron and then to a soft gray, and the lines around his eyes deepened into the folds of a face that had done a great deal of thinking and a fair amount of smiling. He walked more slowly than he once had. In the cold desert mornings, his old wounds spoke to him, the aches of a body that had lived through a night of treachery and carried the memory of it in the bones. But he walked. He rose each day and looked out over the household he had kept, And there was in his face a quality that had not always been there in his younger years, a kind of settledness, the look of a man who had been given more time than he ever expected and had learned not to waste a single hour of it. For in the deepest part of himself, Leto knew what he had escaped. He did not have his son's gift of seeing the futures that would not be. But he was no fool, and he understood, in the plain way that wise men understand hard things, that he was living a life he had very nearly not lived at all. There had been a night, long ago now, when the walls had failed and the enemy had poured in and the trap had very nearly closed on him forever. A moment sooner in the warning, a loyal hand acting in time, and he had been pulled back from the edge of a grave that in another life had swallowed him whole. Every year he had lived since that night was, in a sense, a year he had been given rather than earned. And a man who knows that about his own life carries himself differently. He does not grip. He does not rage. He gives thanks in small, silent ways, in the mornings, in the looking out over the dunes. His son had become the steady man that the boy had always promised to be. Paul in his full growth was calm and unhurried, deep in the eyes, a man whom others instinctively quieted around, not from fear, but from a sense that here was someone who listened before he spoke. He had his mother's stillness and his father's warmth, and something else besides, something that came from the strange country of his gifts, a faint air of a man who had seen further than he ever said. But that further seeing had not made him cold. His father had seen to that. Across all the years of his growing, Leto had done the patient work of keeping his son human. And the work had held. The great thing they had built between them was not a monument or a conquest. It was subtler than that, and stronger. It was a house that worked. Over the long years, father and son had learned to govern side by side, and the learning had gone in both directions. The old Duke brought the long memory, the knowledge of how the great houses moved and schemed, the hard-won instinct for when to press and when to yield. The younger man brought a depth of insight into the desert and its people that even his father could not match, and a way of seeing the far consequences of a near decision that made the councils of House Atreides among the shrewdest in the Imperium. Where once the old Duke had decided everything alone, now the two of them decided together, and the decisions were better for it, tempered on both sides. Neither the rashness of youth nor the caution of age, but something wiser than either. They had their differences, of course, for no father and son of any depth are ever entirely of one mind. There were matters on which the old Duke held to the old ways, and the younger man saw a newer path, and there were quiet disagreements that went on for seasons before one or the other gave way. But the differences never became a wound, because underneath them ran a current of trust so deep and so old that nothing could shift it. The boy had grown up leaning on the father, and the father had grown old leaning, in his turn, on the son, and somewhere across the years the leaning had become mutual, each holding the other up, until it was impossible to say any longer who supported whom. Jessica watched them together, and found in the watching a contentment she had once been sure she would never know. She had come to Arrakis long ago as the concubine of a duke, a Bene Gesserit, trained to serve purposes larger than her own heart, and she had expected, in the deep marrow of her training, that her life would be one of sacrifice and loss. Instead, she had been given this: a duke grown old beside her, a son grown whole, a family that had not been torn apart on a night of fire, but had held together through all the ordinary years, and had ripened, as families do when they are given time, into something rich and settled and deep. She was grayer now, too, and quieter, and there was a peace in her that the young Bene Gesserit she had once been would scarcely have recognized. In the evenings the household would gather, and the old Duke would sit in the warm lamplight with his son near him, and they would speak of small things and large, of the day's business and the years, of memories that had grown soft and comfortable with retelling. Gurney Halleck, grayer himself now, but no less devoted, would sometimes take up his bolicet in the corner and let the old songs move quietly through the room, and the notes would drift out over a house that had kept its heart, and the old Duke, listening, would look at the man his son had become and feel the particular happiness that comes only late in a good life, the happiness of having lasted long enough to see the seed become the tree. For that was the truth of what they had built. Neither of them could have built it alone. A father without his son to inherit and improve upon his work builds only a monument to himself, which crumbles when he does. A son without his father to steady and shape him builds only in reaction, out of grief or hunger, and builds something twisted. But a father and a son together, given the one thing they were so nearly denied, which was simply time, could build a house that would outlast them both, patient and deep-rooted and whole. The old Duke aged in peace. The son stood strong beside him, and between them, in the long quiet passage of the years, they had made something good enough to endure. Up next in Chapter 19, The House That Did Not Fall, we will look upon the whole of what endured, the legacy of a family made whole and a desert held in honor, and see how the house that was so nearly lost passed its peace on into a gentler future. There is a way to measure a house that has nothing to do with its walls. You measure it by what it leaves behind, by whether the good it did outlasts the people who did it, by whether the peace it kept goes on keeping after the keepers are gone. By that measure, House Atreides, in this gentler telling, endured. The house that in another life had fallen on a single night of treachery, that had been scattered and broken and remembered only as a noble ruin, here stood on into the years, secure and settled, and passed its steadiness forward like water passed carefully from one cupped pair of hands to another. Arrakis itself was the first and clearest sign of it. The planet that had been fought over so bitterly in that other, harsher story lay here at peace, worked with a care that had become, over the long years, a kind of love. The spice still flowed, for the spice was the reason the Imperium cared about Arrakis at all, and no house could hold the desert planet and pretend otherwise. But House Atreides had learned to gather the melange without treating the world as a thing to be plundered. Under the long stewardship of the Duke and his son, the harvest went on in balance, neither starving the great powers who depended on it, nor bleeding the desert dry, and the delicate arrangement held, year upon year. Because the ones who kept it understood that a balance is not a thing you win once, but a thing you tend forever. And the desert was honored. This was perhaps the deepest change of all, and the one the old Duke was proudest of, though he was too wise to say so aloud. In the other telling, the desert people had been swept up into a holy war and carried away from themselves, their fierce, beautiful culture consumed by the very flame it had helped to light. Here they remained who they were. The Fremen went on in their sieges in the deep desert, keeping their water discipline and their old ways, and their long patient dream of a green Arrakis, and House Atreides did not use them and did not rule over them as a master rules, but stood beside them as an ally stands. The partnership that had been forged in respect rather than in grief held firm across the years, and the desert people flourished in it, and the house was the stronger for their friendship, and neither had to burn for the other. At the heart of the legacy, holding it all together, was the simplest thing of all, which was a family that had stayed whole. This is easy to say and hard to feel the full weight of, for wholeness is quiet and does not announce itself. But consider what it meant. There was a Duke who had not died. There was a mother who had not fled alone into the sand with her child. There was a son who had not been orphaned, who had grown up with the ordinary, unremarkable gift of a father to turn to. A gift so common that most who have it never think to be grateful, and so precious that those who lose it feel the lack of it forever. All the machinery of statecraft and alliance and spice and empire rested, in the end, on that one small human fact. The family had held. And because it held, everything built upon it held too. The old Duke, in his last long years, took to walking the halls of his house slowly in the evenings, and the walking was a kind of accounting, though a gentle one. He would pass the places where the loyal men of his house went about their business, and he would think of how nearly he had lost them all. Gurney Halleck, whose music still moved through the halls, who had followed his Duke through the worst of it and lived to grow old in a house at peace. The memory of Duncan Idaho, whose steady blade had guarded the family through the dangerous years. The soldiers and the servants and the counselors who had scattered on the night of the trap and had, against all the odds of that other darker story, been gathered back again around a Duke who lived. He had kept his people. That was no small thing. A lord is measured by whether his people come home, and Leto's had come home. Paul, for his part, had become the living bridge between what the house had been and what it would be. He carried in himself both the memory of the near catastrophe and the strange further sight of his gifts, and he used both, quietly, to steer the house away from the rocks that his father could not see. He had learned from Leto the art of patience, the deep, unglamorous work of keeping enemies turned aside and allies bound close, and he practiced it now as a matter of settled habit. The emperor on his distant throne still watched Arrakis with a wary and jealous eye, uneasy that House Atreides had grown so strong and so well loved. But Paul, like his father before him, was careful never to give the throne a reason to strike, and so the tension stayed where tension is safest, held at a distance, simmering but never boiling, year after quiet year. Jessica saw the shape of it all more clearly than anyone, for she had been trained her whole life to see the long designs beneath the surface of things. She had come to Arrakis expecting to play her small part in schemes that stretched across the centuries, the breeding and the prophecy and the patient work of the sisterhood, and she had watched, with a wonder that never entirely left her, as her family slipped free of the terrible design that had been laid for it, and made instead a life of its own. The bloodline endured. The house endured. But it endured as itself, as a family, and not as a prophecy fulfilled. And that difference was everything. She had been meant to be the mother of a catastrophe. She had become, instead, the mother of a house at peace, and the peace passed forward. That was the final measure of the legacy, the one that mattered most. For a house does not truly endure if its peace dies with the one who made it. But the peace that Leto had kept, and that Paul had learned to keep beside him, was built to be handed on. The younger man had been shaped for it since boyhood, taught not only how to hold power, but how to hold it lightly, how to serve the desert and its people, how to keep the balance without being seduced by the temptation to break it in his own favor. When the day came, still years off, but no longer unimaginable, that the old Duke would lay his burden down, the house would not falter. It would go on, secure, into a gentler future than the one it had so nearly suffered, carrying its peace and its honor forward the way a river carries its water to the sea. So this was the legacy of the house that did not fall. Not glory, not conquest, not a name written in fire across the stars. Something quieter and far more durable. A world at peace, a desert honored, a people free, a family whole where once there would have been only loss. It was the sort of legacy that history rarely troubles to record, because history loves its catastrophes and its conquerors, and has little to say about the disasters that were quietly averted. But it was real, and it endured, and the ones who lived inside it knew its worth, and that was enough. Up next in Chapter 20, The Father He Never Lost, we will come at last to the quiet heart of the whole story, and rest there, on the simple miracle of a son who kept his father, and a desert that this time took nothing it did not give back. And so we come, at the last, to the quiet heart of the whole story, which was never the empire or the spice or the great houses at all, but something far smaller and far more precious. It was a son who kept his father. Everything else, all the peace and the endurance and the war that never came, flowed out from that one thing the way a whole oasis flows out from a single hidden spring. Take away the spring, and the oasis is only sand. Keep the spring, and the green goes on. Paul Atreides kept his father, and from that keeping came all the rest. It is worth resting here, in these final quiet moments, on how ordinary the miracle was. There was no magic in it, no prophecy fulfilled, no destiny bending itself to a chosen one. There was only a warning that came a moment sooner than it might have, and a loyal hand that moved in time, and a duke who lived through a night that in another telling would have killed him. From so small a hinge, the whole great door swung, and the boy who would have stood at a grave stood instead at his father's side, and grew up in the shelter of that presence, and became a man rather than a legend. The universe was spared its fire, not by a great deed, but by a small mercy, and that is often the way of the deepest mercies. They come quietly, and they change everything, and afterward, no one can quite say how close the darkness came. Think of all the small things that were saved along with the great one. Not only the billions who went on living without ever knowing the shadow that passed them by, but the little human ordinary things. The ones that never make it into any history. The evenings when father and son sat together in the lamplight and spoke of nothing in particular. The mornings when the old Duke rose and looked out over the dunes and gave his silent thanks for another day. The songs Gurney Halleck let drift through the halls of a house that had kept its heart. The long, comfortable silences between a mother and the family she had been so sure she would lose. None of these things are the stuff of legend. All of them are the stuff of a life. And a life, kept whole, is worth more than any legend ever told. Paul understood this to the very depths of him, for he alone carried the memory of the other path, the one that had not been walked. In the still hours, he could still feel it, faint and far, the ghost of a future where he had become something terrible and lonely and vast, a Messiah he never wished to be, borne up on a tide of grief and worship he could not stop. He had seen that future and turned away from it, and the turning had cost him nothing but the willingness to remain a person. And when he weighed the one life against the other, the ordinary heir against the reluctant God, he never once doubted which was the richer. He would rather keep his father and be merely a man than lose him and be worshipped by the stars. The desert had something to do with this understanding, for the desert teaches its own hard wisdom to those who live long enough with it. The Fremen had a way of thinking about water and about giving and taking, a discipline older than any house, that held that nothing should be taken from the world that was not, in some measure, given back. And it seemed to Paul, in his later years, that this was the truest way to think about the whole of what had happened. In the other telling, the desert had taken everything, his father, his innocence, his very self, and had given back only power, which is the coldest of all the coins. But in this telling, the desert took nothing it did not give back. It gave the family shelter and asked only respect. It gave the house its riches and asked only balance. It gave the young man his strange gifts and asked, in return, only that he not be consumed by them. And the bargain held, because for once it was a fair one, kept fairly on both sides. The old Duke came, at the very end of his long life, to a peace so deep and so settled that those around him found it hard to grieve, even as they knew the parting drew near. He had been given the one thing he had most wanted and most nearly lost, which was time. The time to grow old beside the people he loved. The time to see his son become a good man. The time to hand his house forward whole. A man who dies with that behind him does not die robbed. He had been spared the grave that once awaited him, and had spent the years he was given wisely and warmly. And when at last the time came for him to lay his burden down, he laid it down as a man lays down a tool at the end of a long day's honest work, tired and content and without regret. His son was there. His people were there. The desert wind moved softly over the house, and it took nothing it had not given, and the old Duke went to his rest in peace. And Paul, who had kept his father through all the years he was most needed, found that he could carry the loss when at last it came, precisely because it had come in its own good time and not in fire and treachery. There is a world of difference between a father torn away and a father let go. The first is a wound that never fully closes. The second is a sorrow, but a whole and healthy one, the natural sorrow of a life completed rather than a life cut short. Paul grieved as a son should grieve, deeply and without bitterness. And then he took up the house his father had left him and carried it forward into the gentler future it had been built for. The load-bearing wall had held for exactly as long as it was needed, and by the time it was gone, the house had grown strong enough to stand without it. So the story closes as it began, on sand. The great dunes of Arrakis lie silver under the twin moons, as they have lain for uncounted ages, indifferent to the small dramas of the houses that come and go upon them. But tonight, in this telling, the sand holds no grief. The house that was so nearly lost still stands upon the desert, secure and quiet, its lamps burning low, its people sleeping soundly, its heart unbroken. Somewhere in the deep desert the Fremen keep their old ways in peace. Somewhere in the halls the last notes of an old song have faded into stillness. And the whole vast universe beyond, the empire and the spice and the great houses in all their endless intrigue, turns on above a world that kept, against all the odds, the one thing that mattered most. A son who kept his father. A house that kept its heart. A desert that, this time, took nothing it did not give back. There is nothing left now but the peace of it, and the soft sound of the wind moving over the sand, and the rest that comes to those who are, at last, safe and whole and home. Let it settle over you now like the cool of the desert night. The fire never came. The house still stands. The family is whole, and everything, everywhere, is finally, quietly at peace. Rest now. All is well. Sleep, and so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed the night the trap should have closed, and the Duke who lived when he was fated to fall. We watched a traitor undone, a house enduring on Arrakis, and a father's steady hand guiding his son. We saw Paul and Leto side by side, the Harkonnen threat held at bay, and Jessica finding a quieter peace. We followed a young man learning to rule beside his father. The Fremen come as allies, and the loyal house gathered close around Gurney and Duncan. We watched the spice flow without the war, Chani met in a gentler time. The emperor kept at a wary distance, and a duke's wisdom set against the dark. And we came, at the end, to a jihad that never came. An old duke and a grown son. A house that did not fall. And the father Paul never lost. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those distant and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet desert at dawn. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.